meetups. For those of you who are frequently going to tech meetups, it can be hard to kind of stay in the game, connect with other people. So trying to do more of this stuff remotely. So thank you for coming. Our mission at Operation Code is primarily focused on helping veterans, military spouses, transitioning military personnel learn software development and enter the tech industry and code the future. That being said, we're interested in kind of bringing our sense of service and our sense of desire to help people get in the tech industry out to the world. So regardless of the background that you're coming from, we're excited to have you all here. And I know that Kevin and Kyle, and especially Oscar, looking right at you, Oscar, they've got something great planned for this evening. I think there's going to be some good stuff for you all to learn, and hope you enjoy it.
Jesus, pressure much?
I wanted to give that one to you.
So, yeah. So for tonight, we have 3 speakers. So the first one is Oscar. He's currently a senior engineer at Troops. Would you like to talk about what you do real quick?
Sure. I break shit, apparently. I broke prod 1.5 times today. I'm a lead front-end engineer for a relatively small engineering team. We're something like about a dozen tech people right now. Thanks, Conrad. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm lead front-end engineer, like I said. What that means is that I own our configuration UI for our product. What we do at Troops is largely our product is kind of a sales workflow tool. So we integrate chat with your data source. Right now, that largely means we bring Salesforce into Slack so that you don't have to go to Salesforce. If you've ever had to interact with Salesforce, you know that it's powerful, but it's terrible. And Slack's a much nicer experience. So pretty happy with that. Our stack, since this is relevant to today's conversation, our front-end stack at the very least is React, Redux, TypeScript, and Flow. We're migrating from Flow to TypeScript. If you're not sure what those things are, that's okay. We'll talk about it. We use every Redux middleware under the sun, currently migrating towards Redux Saga. We use a mixture of style components and CSS modules. Again, if you don't know what these things are, we're going to talk about it. And yeah, I guess that pretty much covers it.
Awesome. All right. So I was going to transition that right over to going into Oscar's talk. But before I do that, let me just go over the leadership real quick. So me, Evans, and Oscar here, the 3 of us here, we're the co-chapter leaders. Evans and I were been here since the beginning, and Oscar joined in halfway. So we've been running this for about 2 years or so for locally for New York City. We just met up in a bar one day, and it's like, yo, why don't we have Operation Code here? It doesn't make sense. It's like, duh, why don't we start one? So here we are 2 years later. So we are open to everybody. So we help military veterans transition into tech, so everybody's welcome to join. One of the things that we really care about is bridging the gap between the military and the civilian. And so everybody's welcome here. And tonight's topic is the front end. We're going to be delving into the front end. It's not just the HTML and CSS like people think it is. People used to think it was. Actually, it was. It was just like static HTML page, and you just update some CSS and you're set. It is no longer any of that. And it has grown complex, and we're going to be diving into what some of the ecosystem involving around the front end is. And after that, I'm going to go into talking about some of the interviews. So front-end interviews can be a little different because it requires a lot of breadth of knowledge and experience. And so I'll be diving into talking about that a little bit too. And to finish it off, we're going to have Kyle, who's a senior engineer. Are you a senior engineer? Forget, but he's a software engineer.
Senior in my heart.
Gotcha. All right, he's a software engineer at Acorns. He's going to be talking his great talk on front-end testing. And I've done plenty of front-end testing and got my butt whooped. So it's a very, very hard and important topic. So we got all of those in store for you today. And then now we're going to transition over to Oscar, and he's going to give you an introduction to the current modern front-end system. Right, take it away.
All right, I'm going to try anyway. Let's see. I'm going to share my screen. All right, can we all see that? Can I get a confirmation that we can actually
I can
see my screen, but also read kind of what's on there?
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. Okay, so a couple more things actually about some background here. I did not always do this. I've actually only been doing this for a few years. I used to work as a stagehand, and I transitioned into web development by attending App Academy back in 2016. And then I taught there for a couple of years. And it was a really, really great experience. But I think that one of the things that that helped me understand was, first of all, it's a humbling experience to go from one career to another. And I imagine that there are many people with us here tonight that have experienced that or are experiencing that right now. So just wanted you to know, I get it. And you have my sympathies, my real empathies actually. And you know, I know that this is kind of daunting. At the same time, we might, like as Kevin said, might underestimate. So I really feel like we can sort of go between those two extremes pretty often, especially when we think about front-end development. We might think that this is pretty easy. It's just a little HTML, a little CSS, a little JavaScript. And depending on, you know, who you're talking to, you might be hearing some version of that from a lot of people. You might think that yourself. And at the same time, if you're really starting to dig into this and you're starting to get serious about it, you might think, how am I ever going to learn all of this? So what I'm going to try to do today is give some insight into what actually goes into professional web development in the last, you know, as of the last year or so, with the caveat that you do not need to be an expert at all of these things in order to be a competent front-end developer. Right? Kevin is working at Amazon. Kevin is a very, very good software engineer. He's a very, very good front-end engineer.
For sure.
He is, and there are plenty of things on this diagram that he does not know. I like to think I'm quite good at my job. There are plenty of things on this diagram that I am not an expert in, or that I have never had meaningful experience with. I'm sure Kyle has similar experiences with a great many things in this diagram. We can all attest to this. It's a continual learning process. So we're going to try to uncover some of the complexity, and at the same time, I really want to make sure that we're not getting too discouraged here. So know that I'm also not looking at the camera. Sorry about that. That's kind of where my view of the diagram is. So I also won't be able to see if there are any chat questions coming in. I will try to leave some time for questions at the end. Cool. All right, so let's start with those basics. Right, I think we can all see my cursor. We have HTML, we have CSS, and we have JavaScript. Chances are you have encountered at the very least in your life, just even as a non-technical person, HTML. Right, this is what we use to provide the structure of our document that's sent to the browser. This is what the browser understands so that it can render something back at you. It's comprised of tags. It's actually pretty simple. This is the part of front-end development that is really kind of straightforward in a lot of ways at its core. Certainly, writing semantic HTML requires an understanding of, well, what does semantic mean in the context of HTML, and how that ends up serving search engine optimization. So how our web pages are discoverable by search engines like Google, as well as being discoverable by assisting devices such as screen readers, right? What happens when our user is not somebody who can see our screen or somebody who is able to use a mouse, right? So the HTML that we write actually makes our web page more accessible to users who are not necessarily able to use all of the devices that other people might be able to use. So at its core, though, HTML is kind of the backbone of what we're building here. That's what's going to provide something for the browser to render. Next, we have CSS. CSS is another one that seems pretty straightforward when you first get into it. It's a pretty minimal language. It's a very minimal language, actually. It's just a way of providing style rules for elements that you select. So we have all of these HTML elements in our web app, and we can say, hey, I want all P tags to have the color red. Cool. You can do that pretty simply with CSS. And so that's very basic CSS. We use CSS for a bit more than that though, right? We don't just want to change colors of things, we want to change the layout. So CSS is really responsible for the entire presentation of your application, what it looks like, what it feels like, often some bits of functionality as well. So we use this to create layouts, we use it to work for different kinds of devices, work for different screen sizes. We now in 2020, and have for a few years now, provide the same web page often for a desktop that we do for a mobile experience. And we have to write CSS that accommodates both of those things. And we use media queries within CSS to get that experience. I really think that this Learn CSS 3 thing is a bit much. CSS 3 has been around for a while, but the point here is we want to make sure that we're learning the latest CSS, and we want to make use of all the tools that it provides us. So CSS is responsible for styling your HTML and making sure that we have the experience that we want for our users. And then finally, we have JavaScript. And this is where we start feeling like we're real programmers. Because this is true. This is the part of front-end web development or front-end development that gives us functions and objects and data types, really a full-fledged programming language. And so it's important that if we want to be front-end developers, that we are not just passingly competent in JavaScript, but really capable and fluent with it. So we need to learn that syntax. We need to understand the tools that it gives us and where its limitations lie as well. We also have to understand what it's actually intended to do for us. So for instance, JavaScript is there to manipulate what's actually rendered in the browser. Right? And we have something known as the DOM, the document object model that the browser exposes to us. That's our API. That's our interface from JavaScript to manipulate what the browser is showing the user, what's available to them. So we need to be competent in that as well. We also need to fetch additional resources in the background. Oftentimes you click a button on a web page that you visit and it goes and communicates with something else in the background. You don't see a full page reload. Instead, it submits your form, or it, imagine clicking like on Facebook. That's JavaScript in action. That is JavaScript running off a request to one of Facebook's servers and saying, this user, you, liked this post, and it tells it which post. So we need to be competent with that as well, because JavaScript at the end of the day is going to give us that level of interactivity that we expect from modern web apps. I want to actually show something really quickly. I don't know how well you guys can see this. I'm gonna try to zoom it in a little bit. We're here on the right side. This is what Apple's website looked like in 1995. And we really just didn't expect much back then. In fact, this was right around the time that JavaScript was created, because we were, I guess it was 97. The point here being that we really didn't expect much interactivity back then. Maybe not we, maybe for some of you it's your parents. I'm realizing I'm aging myself. But the point is that now we expect a whole lot more. If we actually go over to apple.com now, we have a whole different experience with animations and buttons that trigger different events. This is all courtesy of JavaScript. And this is just a simple e-commerce website. This isn't anything fancy. This isn't even Facebook, which is an enormously complex web app and entirely powered by JavaScript. So how do we get there? I mean, for those of us who are working in this field, we kind of get that. But for anybody among us right now who's thinking, yeah, I want to be a front-end web developer, how do we start to build these applications? Well, the truth is that with just knowing, being competent with HTML, CSS, and plain old vanilla JavaScript, you can, on your own, create an interactive website. So long as you can get it deployed somewhere, you can do it with just those three things. You probably don't want to stop there, though. You probably actually want to build something a little bit more complex. And that's where front-end web development gets tricky, because there is complexity involved with this. I mean, imagine if we go back to our Apple site, our current Apple site, building all of this by yourself with just JavaScript. You could. You definitely could. HTML, CSS, get those images loaded in. Yeah, you could totally do this. But
you can actually create that with just HTML and CSS, I think.
You could. You totally could. CSS transitions. I mean, certainly the managing the state of which thing you're looking at, it's a little harder, but because you have to bring in other tools such as hash tags and everything, but JavaScript certainly makes this easier. And even beyond that, even just beyond JavaScript making it easier, we're not the first people to ever solve this problem. So why should we solve it entirely ourselves? And this is where the JavaScript ecosystem starts to help us out. If we head back to our handy diagram, we have to think about the fact that there are tons of other JavaScript developers out there who have all solved a variety of problems. And we can pull in their solutions as we need them. This is made available as packages. Packages are just a way of distributing software, and we use package managers to gain access to them. So right now that means NPM and Yarn, they're both pointing to a registry that holds those packages and allows you to, you can upload to that registry. So if you have something you want to share, you can. But more importantly, for most users, it allows you to pull from that registry to specify which version of which package you want. And then declare that as a locked dependency. So you can say, I want this version always, or something adjacent to this version always. And NPM and Yarn both provide you, at least in 2020, a reasonable degree of speed in downloading those packages, which is important for building your application, as well as an enormous number of applications. I think they're both pointing at the same registry in the end, and the ability to run scripts. These are roughly equivalent, but the important thing here is that as a JavaScript developer, as a front-end developer, you're probably going to be making extensive use of the package manager. So moving on from there, I'm not going to touch everything in this diagram because again, there's a lot here, and we really only have so much time to talk about front-end development. But let's think about some of the other complexities that we might run into. As you are creating a simple web application, something that's maybe a handful of pages, something that you're just maintaining yourself, something that's just for fun, or maybe it's for a very small business. Sure, you can get by, again, with just HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and maybe you do want to pull in a few packages. I'm talking about how you get those together at another point. But as your application gets bigger, you might decide, wow, CSS is actually kind of hard. Because, as I said earlier, CSS is a pretty minimal language. And minimal, this is a little bit unfair to CSS, but minimal can also mean under-featured, which really just means that CSS is not necessarily providing the best developer experience. It makes it a little bit harder to do something. Not impossible, of course, but harder to do some of the style rules that you might want and select some of the elements in a way that you would want. And so we have a number of preprocessors that are available to us that allow us to use a nicer syntax as well as familiar concepts from regular programming languages such as variables and functions. Some of these things are available in core CSS, don't get me wrong, but something like Sas has grown really popular because the features that it offers over regular CSS allow you to get really, really far. And so what we end up doing is writing Sas code, which is a superset of CSS. That is, it contains valid CSS as well as Sas syntax, and it gets processed into valid CSS for the browser to understand. Often that also includes appending various browser prefixes. And that's important because browsers are not actually standardized. The CSS that works in Chrome does not necessarily work in Safari, which also doesn't necessarily work the same in Internet Explorer. And there are a lot of people still using Internet Explorer. So these are things we might want to think about as our application grows in complexity and as we want to serve more users. So this is something we need to be familiar with and have configured, and then that affects the code that we end up writing. I'm not really going to touch on CSS frameworks. We can talk about that at another point, but that's a different topic unto itself. We do want to think, though, about how we organize our CSS. I'm going to bump this down just a little bit. How we organize our CSS. CSS architecture. Architecture is kind of a fancy word for what we're doing here, but basically this is a way of saying, I want to take my cascading style sheets, and that's what CSS stands for, my cascading styles, and localize them a little bit. I want them to be a little bit better organized so that they're more predictable, more understandable, less prone to error or regression that is causing a problem that wasn't there before in our UI. So probably these are all really great ways of essentially what they come down to are naming conventions for your CSS classes. BEM has probably been my personal favorite for a while when I have written CSS in this style. I think it's really effective. BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. It's just a way, again, of scoping your CSS to a block and then saying which element you're referring to, say an H3. With a modifier, this is an H3 that is meant to serve this purpose.
I just want to add something real quick.
Yeah.
So all the
BEM.
yeah, so not even that. So all the yellow boxes here, when it branches up to the side and says BEM or over CSS and SMACs, so the ones that are colored in yellow are the predominantly popular ones these days. And so that's what it's denoting. I've seen a SMACs package once. Everything else has been BEM this entire time. And
Yeah,
so,
I've seen CSS a couple times, but BEM is definitely the most popular.
Yep.
And I really enjoyed using it. Cool. So I want to take a pause here and actually think about what we're talking about now. Now we're talking about additional tools that you're going to need to master to be an effective front-end developer, but why do we need to have these tools? Ultimately, the problem that we're trying to solve for is complexity. Our brains are only so big. They can only hold so many things at once. And your web app will grow. Just your front-end web app, let alone the full stack, just your front-end web app will grow past your ability eventually to conceive of everything that it entails. And so what all of these tools aim to do is abstract away parts of this, make it a little bit easier. So it's either papering over something that details that you shouldn't need to worry about on a regular basis, or constraining the problem to something smaller that you can understand. So in this case, BEM is actually meant to constrain the problem a little bit so that you don't have to consider how your style is going to affect other elements on your page. For other things like the package managers, if we go back to that, that's taking solutions from others and applying them so that you don't have to think about solving those every time you need a solution for them. Well, I'm actually also going to skip over, for now at the very least, build tools, simply because we could spend a long time just talking about those. Suffice to say, Kevin's unhappy with me skipping over that. The reason why I'm choosing to skip over that for now at the very least, and we can come back to it in Q&A, is that ultimately we want to focus right now on just the code that we're writing. The way that we deliver that to the client is worthy of its own discussion. Suffice to say that it's really difficult unto itself. And it's often the thing that gives me the biggest headache, particularly wrestling with Webpack.
oh God, I've been in Webpack land. I've been diving into Webpack lately.
My worst days are configuration days. Anything that involves me starting up or modifying a configuration. So that's a really, really important part of this. Please don't mistake me not talking about it for any disrespect to it. It's really difficult and really, really important. It should get its own talk. We talked about organizing CSS so that we can constrain a problem. We talked about bringing in packages so that we can rely on the solutions from others. But it turns out also that sometimes the problems that we're trying to solve are just really, really hard to do with vanilla JavaScript. It requires a lot of manual control over over rendering, over data fetches, over state management. And it turns out that somebody's done that better. So this is kind of an extension of the talk about packages and package managers, or not package managers per se, but the idea of pulling in somebody else's solution to help you out. We might want to pick a framework. What frameworks allow us to do is say, I don't want to necessarily, in the case of say React, I don't want to directly manage renders. I don't want to directly manage DOM manipulation. In fact, I want to leave that entirely to somebody else. What I want to do is just manage the data in my application and have the rendering happen automatically. And not just automatically, but performantly. And so React is a way to get that in a lot of cases. Certainly not guaranteed. You still need to be mindful of how you're causing updates to happen, but you never actually have to manually trigger a render with React. And so that's where some of the power of picking a framework can come into play, especially for larger and larger and larger applications. Angular and Vue are also definitely top tier, but React is by far, by a pretty good margin in 2020, especially the leader of the pack as far as front-end development is concerned. We're gonna spend a little bit more time here because we got a question before the talk started tonight about state management. As Kevin was also noting at that time, we do actually have to manage a fair bit of data now. Right? Like we head back over to, again, it's a simple e-commerce website. It's not even a single page application fully, but it does have to know, like, okay, so this user is located here and it's looking at this this set of computers. So in order to do that, it's probably using some notion of state. The state being, we're looking at 16-inch right now. And it uses that to know which models to render back at you. That's a really simple example, but you can imagine that our state grows more and more complex. Maybe our state needs to know which users logged in. Maybe our state needs to know about a number of other users that this user might interact with. And what are their names? What are their avatars? What's their profile information? Who are their friends on this site if we're talking about a social networking site, et cetera, et cetera. And so it starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger and much harder to manage manually, much harder to manage, especially in disparate little places as you might find yourself doing in a normal React application or even a vanilla JavaScript application. And so a lot of us have turned towards state management solutions. I'm confused about why MobX is yellow here. It's certainly not unpopular, but Redux is by far the more popular solution.
Yeah.
These are, suffice to say, these are both state management solutions that also offer a number of other bits of functionality that you might find really, really useful. Redux is my personal favorite, but that's also a bias from having used it professionally for years now. So we went from talking about organization and packages to looking at frameworks and state management. We're really getting into the weeds now about with more complex applications and how we might build them. Let's take a detour back into, let's head back into CSS, because we talked about organizing your CSS with BEM. BEM, again, is a fantastic paradigm. It's really useful. At the same time, we're still thinking about separating CSS from our JavaScript. Why is that potentially problematic? Well, in React, what we're thinking about when we build our UI is a component-based UI. We use JavaScript to generate HTML for us. Why not have our CSS there as well? In fact, if we're thinking about a component-based UI, that is, our UI is built up of Lego blocks, why not keep our styles right alongside them so that whenever we want to plug in that Lego block somewhere, we also plug in the styles? This is the kind of coupling, the kind of tying together of things in programming that we want. Because if we want that component, we're almost guaranteed to also want the styles to come with it. And that's where CSS and JS can get really, really powerful. CSS modules allows you to just import your styles directly into your JavaScript code. So that JavaScript code that's generating HTML also has access to your CSS really, really easily. It's all right there together. Styled components, and that's where the real magic happens, because that allows us to create components that also have styles baked in. So we're no longer writing separate CSS files. We're actually putting the CSS all the way into the JavaScript. It's living right there with it. It's actually declared using JavaScript with CSS syntax in a template literal. If you're not sure what a template literal is, we can talk about that after. So that is my preferred way of styling most things now. CSS modules also have been pretty good to me, but styled components are kind of where it's at, especially in 2020. Testing your apps, Kyle's doing a whole talk on that. Suffice to say, it's really hard and super important. So I'm gonna let him do that. I'm also gonna skip over progressive web apps, mostly because I don't have any professional experience with them. It's a really important topic, but like I said, we don't know everything, and I'm not gonna make a fool of myself in front of you. This is also something that not everybody encounters in their professional career. Many of you will if you are front-end developers or go down this path, or you know, are going down this path. But there's a good number of you who won't, and that's okay too. So
I'll add something real quick. So think of it as like a set of principles and guidelines and tools that are provided for you to give a better experience to the user. So it will provide you some service workers. You can catch some content on the browser side in the local storage. So it gives you different tools and some patterns around it. So it's a set of like concepts to provide to the user.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's actually, I could have just said that, couldn't I? Yeah, that's a great summary there. And again, you know,
that's why all those topics listed there are so just off the wall and so different. It just combines all of these different things to provide the user with a great experience.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, you can say that about kind of this whole diagram in a way. These are a lot of very different and disparate topics, and we can start to see, especially as we get towards the end of the diagram here, how front-end development is kind of not one monolith, right? We started this talking about HTML, CSS, and some basic JavaScript. And now we're talking about progressive web apps. We're talking about testing. We're talking about CSS and JS. And these end up, we can see that this actually is very difficult and complex and varied field. It's about 7:20, so I'm gonna start winding things down so that we can move
you guys
forward.
took about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, this is your favorite one right here.
Yeah, it is. This is pretty great. This is pretty great. Okay, so for those of you who have prior programming experience, depending on if you went to college, and if you studied any computer science, even an intro course in college, depending on where you went, you probably learned Python, or if you are ancient like me, you probably learned Java or C++ or something like that. If you learned Python, then you might have heard that it's a dynamically typed language. So is JavaScript. So is vanilla JavaScript. And what that really means is that a variable can be declared as, say, a string, or it can be given a value that is a string, and it can later be changed to hold an object or a number. And JavaScript is totally fine with that. Whereas Java is a statically typed language. And what that means is that you have to declare upfront when you're declaring your variable, even before you define it, what kind of data type it's going to hold. So if this thing is going to hold an integer, you have to say int variable name, and then you get to define the variable. There are pros and cons to static versus dynamic, and obviously way oversimplified there, but there are pros and cons to both approaches. Dynamic often the argument is that you can write something faster because you don't have to worry about type annotations. You just put something out there and the language will largely accept it unless you do something that actually breaks. Problem is that you could actually break something and the language didn't tell you that it was going to break until it broke. Statically typed languages will tell you right away because they have a type checker at compile time that, hey, this doesn't make sense. You said this function is supposed to expect an integer, and you gave it an object. I don't even know what to do. How do I add 2 objects? So this is where type checkers can actually be really, really important. Certainly for small applications, we go back to the basics. Regular old JavaScript, probably gonna do just fine. For even some medium-sized applications, plain old JavaScript, it's gonna do just fine. You don't need any of this fancy static typing. But for larger applications, and Kevin can now attest to this, he's finally come over to my side on this. For larger applications, having that compiler prove to you algebraically that your code is likely correct, that is powerful. And that saves you on bugs, that saves you on QA time, that could save your company a lot of money from not pushing bugs into production. This ends up becoming an enormous part of our testing layer if used correctly. And it is up to the developer to use it correctly. This is a really, really difficult tool to use because it requires, you can get by really for a long time with JavaScript without understanding a lot of hardcore computer science concepts. I don't recommend that you do, but you can get by for a very long time and be a very competent developer in a lot of ways, in a lot of meaningful ways, without getting too deep into computer science. Once we start getting into TypeScript, we at the very least have to have some, or any sort of static type checker. We start to need a stronger understanding of math. And I don't mean arithmetic, I mean math. Because we need to understand intersections and unions. We need to understand all sorts of what George Maurer in this calls type math. If you can get that, you become God. You own your code. So big fan of TypeScript. I used to enjoy Flow. TypeScript far outpaced Flow. And I basically consider Flow, especially in the last year, to be worthless. So use TypeScript.
So I'm just going to add something there.
Go for it, please.
Oscar and I, he knows it's coming. Oscar and I have been arguing about TypeScript for a while. I like to write fast. I like to be expressive with my code, and I like to just flow and go with the flow. And I did not believe in TypeScript or typing until I broke something on Amazon on production. I saw the code and what I broke, and I'm like, TypeScript would have caught this. Yeah. That just realizing like this, with my mind, that my brain could not have traced this as a human being, but TypeScript would have caught it. So that's when I really became, you know what, like, yeah, like I don't want to break stuff on prod on Amazon. I really, really don't.
Yeah.
So that was my lesson.
Yeah, and I'll say that for the common argument against static languages and for dynamic languages is that it is fast. You can write code faster in dynamic languages. I don't think it's controversial to say that, yeah, of course you can write it faster if you don't have to put in the annotations. But I can write correct code faster in TypeScript. I can write provably correct code where I don't have to go back and fix, oh shit, how does this work again? What is this expecting? That combined with the compiler giving me the proof plus the IDE support that TypeScript enables, I've done coding challenges, which are supposed to be short by nature with a static type checker, and it makes everything goes faster for me. So that's an anecdotal bit there. Please, like that's not data, but certainly the case for me. That's kind of it, actually. I don't really want to get into these last things. I want to leave these last 4 minutes for some quick Q&A.
So then actually, there is a question from the audience.
Yes.
Specifically regarding Gatsby and static site generator.
Okay.
So the person wanted to know like the market for it and if that should learn it. In my opinion, so Gatsby. So I think it's pretty popular. Has anybody like used Gatsby lately? It is a good knowledge to have.
I believe we use it at Opcode for.
Oh, are we using it? Gotcha.
Yeah, I got strong opinions on this.
Oh, there you go.
used
Go
it.
for it.
Yes, please.
So the way that I feel about Gatsby is that I appreciate the effort that they're making in creating like a very awesome build system and pushing the web towards doing things statically. But at the same time, there's no way I would recommend anybody use Gatsby when tools like Next.js exist, which does everything Gatsby does, and also more in terms of providing server rendering instead of just a static target.
Yeah.
And the other cool thing is you can do all three systems. So if you want client-side rendering, you can have that. If you want your static app, you can have that. If you want server rendering, you can have that. And you can have a mix of them per page. Gatsby cannot do that, can only do static.
Right.
So not only there, but also I think a limitation happens when Gatsby requires you to use GraphQL for data fetching and also to use the static build time processing. Whereas Next.js, you can do whatever library you want for data fetching. They don't care.
Can I say something too?
Sure.
I've used Gatsby JS, my personal side. Like you said, I totally agree with Kyle. Great for static sites. I've actually just, my portfolio website, I built it on Gatsby. Then I just went back to React, pure just React, and using some other libraries. I forgot the moment the name. There's so many JavaScript libraries in the world. Yeah, there's like something new, JS. I forgot what it was called, but I was just using this. Just rewrote the whole. Gatsby does hold your hand a lot too. I've gotten, like some people told me that Gatsby JS it's a very beginner tool, and it's just to help you with like if you just make templates. I even heard from I remember you once told me, Kevin, that this is how you made your first portfolio website with Gatsby JS, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, my little blog that I used to have, I did make it out of Gatsby.
Yeah, I've used it, but I just started to move away from it more and more, just so I could just make everything.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like there's a better option available with Next.js. And also regarding the question of whether you should learn a static site generator, yeah, definitely learn about static site generator and server-side rendering in general, like tie those up. And it's a good knowledge to have.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, especially learning a good server side, like Next.js is definitely, I'm certainly no expert at it, but because I haven't had to be, but I will need to be at some point, I'm sure of it. It opens up a whole world of technical opportunities for you and your team and your product. So definitely worth learning.
We've got some questions, so we got like a minute, but should we understand like the networking concepts? If you mean by like HTTP and a GET request and POST request and request and responses, yes, you should know the basics and fundamentals of those.
Yeah. You should understand how to make API requests and how to design a reasonable API. Because if you know how to design a reasonable API, you know how to talk to both reasonable and unreasonable APIs. And you also start to understand the dangers of just taking a bad response and dumping it into your JavaScript application. This is a whole other talk that I could do on API layers. But yeah, yes, as a front-end developer, you should understand, at the very least, just basic HTTP communication.
What is it? Yeah, like Postman. Learn how to use like Postman or like a request manager too. That's important.
Learn how to curl.
Yep. All right. Then we actually have like some questions, but we'll try to leave those at the end after we're done, and we'll try to get through these questions. For now, I'm gonna switch over to my portion of it.
Hold on, Kevin. Just one thing, actually.
Go for
it. I want to say that if you still have questions that aren't getting answered before we sign off today, that's okay. These are really good questions. We still want them. Come over to Slack. All right, you're all on your computers. You have no excuse. Come over to the Slack community. If you're not part of it already, go to operationcode.org and join us. If you are part of Slack, you can come to the NYC channel. You also know that there are a number of other channels There's the web dev channel, there's JavaScript, there's React.js, ton of channels that you can ask these questions in with far smarter people than us. Anyway, Kevin, take it away.
All right. So let me share my screen. All right, is my screen showing?
Yep.
Awesome. This doc. So I haven't used this in forever. All right, so today I want to talk to you about front-end engineering interview and how to prepare for entry mid-level positions. So as for myself, I'm a front-end engineer at Amazon right now. I've been at Amazon for about a year, and I've been coding professionally for about 3 years now. So I am reaching that, getting out of entry and getting into the mid-level portion. And so that's the topic that the level I'll be speaking at. So before all this coding craziness, I was in the military. I served in the Army from 2010 to 2014. I was stationed up in Alaska. Spent 3 years up there, and I was in Afghanistan from 2011 to 2012 as an infantryman. And so after the military, did a bunch of different things, started a small business with a friend. I'm selling eyeglasses, similar to Warby Parker, where you come online, fill out your prescription, and we'll ship it out to you. During that time, I wanted to make a website better. And I got into, that's how I just opened up DevTools in Chrome and started messing around with the CSS, and that's exactly how I got into coding. Wanted to do more advanced stuff, and just realized I had to learn JavaScript, and just from there, just went full speed and haven't looked back since. So that was back then, and now I'm sitting here, and I've been working for a little bit to know, I feel like, okay, I'm starting to understand the front end a little bit. So I am going through that Dunning-Kruger curve. If you don't know what Dunning-Kruger is, it's a term for when a beginner thinks they know more than they think they do. So quite simply, as a beginner, you don't know what you don't know. You don't even know how much you have to learn. So I'm at the point, so when you go over that hump, you reach a point, it's like, oh my God, I don't know anything. I don't know how to do anything. Everything is difficult and hard. I am reaching kind of that point. But at the same time, I feel like I'm starting to get a handle on front end and how to be able to deliver a good product to our users. So I'm going to go into some of the things, especially like an Amazon would look for in a front end engineer. All right, so these are some of the fundamentals. So you may not be tested on all of these, but these are some of the topics you should absolutely expect. And I'll go into where you might be asked with some of these and when you won't. So HTML and CSS, that's your bread and butter. HTML controls the layout of the page, and CSS styles the page. I personally, as a front-end engineer, for my first 2 years as being a front-end engineer, never touched the HTML and CSS. But so there are front-end jobs that you don't touch these. However, you need to be proficient and understand and be able to manipulate them as well. And we'll go into a little bit more about each of these topics as we go. And the next one is JavaScript. That one is the most important one. You must know JavaScript. If you don't know JavaScript, everything else falls apart. JavaScript is the glue that holds everything together. And so everything down here below JavaScript, if you don't understand JavaScript, then you're gonna have trouble with everything that falls below this. And so JavaScript is a really important one, and I'll get into that also. And the front-end frameworks. So some places you're not going to be tested on frameworks. At Amazon, you're not going to be asked any kind of framework questions. You don't have to know any kind of like state management, React or Redux, and none of that. But at some companies, you will. So we'll talk about more about that. And the front-end ecosystem, NPM, Webpack, and Babel. So it's not even just about these tools. It's about what these tools are supposed to do, what their purpose is, and recognizing those is important. And next one is the browser fundamentals. So in the browser, especially, I'm specifically speaking about the DOM. Being able to select a node from the DOM and be able to traverse the DOM and be able to manipulate whatever you select is very, very important as a front-end engineer. That is, so you got HTML, CSS, and you got JavaScript. So you got a layout and you got the style. What JavaScript does, it's the glue that holds HTML and CSS together by providing DOM manipulation, being able to provide data to it, being able to control DOM. And so knowing how to use the DOM is really important. And you got web performance. That's a critical rendering path, how to get your site to load faster, some asset management. It's important to know. And you also need to know your HTTP requests and responses, some of the basic status codes. And also you need to know system design. So this is a little bit of a tricky one, and I'll get more into it when we get there. And also the data structures and algorithms. So this one's going to be optional. If you're going to be interviewing at Google, Amazon, Facebook, then definitely expect the data structures and algorithm questions and prepare for those. But if you're not interviewing for some of the other like the more challenging companies to interview at, then this part is optional. However, I strongly recommend you as an engineer for your own growth to learn the fundamentals of DSNA. So that is definitely my recommendation on it. So let's go into some of the more specifics. So in HTML and CSS, what should you know? You should obviously know some of the common HTML tags and the semantics. So semantic tags that Oscar talked about earlier. So actually prescribing a meaning to the tags that you put on. Instead of just putting down div, putting into like section, menu, being able to provide meaning behind them gives better accessibility. So accessibility is actually a really, really big topic, especially at my company, at Amazon. We actually really pride ourselves in providing some of the best accessibility experience to any disabled users. So there's a huge amount of emphasis on that. And so being able to manipulate this is where it starts. And so if anybody knows anybody disabled who has trouble hearing, trouble seeing, trouble reading, just any of those, this is where you control their lives with. You directly help their lives by providing good semantic HTML tags. So they can use a screen reader, great screen reader, if you do a good job of providing them. And so being able to know those for HTML is important. The next one, I think this is the most important one. It's the selectors. So BEM is a great way to manage the selectors. Selectors and the specificity around them, being able to select an element of the page is very important. And being able to provide, being able to select you choose like the reliable selectors. And also ones that don't have the computational load. By changing around the specificity, there's a way that it will have to traverse the entire DOM all the way until it finds it, or you can just have to traverse the DOM once to be able to find what you need. And so that comes down to actually BEM. BEM actually really provides a really good way of managing that. So, and another thing you should be aware of is like Z-index and context stacking. This one can be a little bit tricky. Heck, I actually have to if I were to be interviewed, I would have to actually have to look it up again. Exactly what controls, what resets context stacking. And so Z-index is important to know because you are going to eventually run into a bug as a front engineer where something is showing on top of something and you can't get rid of it and just pulling your hair out. You're just going to run into it. And so it's a good one to learn. Flexbox, and I should have actually added the CSS grid to this. So those are two predominant systems out right now for laying out, providing a layout on the page. And I personally use Flexbox a lot. I have not had the opportunity to use CSS Grid for any kind of production application other than any kind of toy apps. But you should be familiar with some kind of like a layout system that would make it more manageable for you. So Flexbox or CSS Grid, get to know them. And also you should be aware of some basic transforms and transitions where you animate or you move the element or you modify the element, the shape in any way. I don't have the syntax memorized. I don't know all of them, but I do know what they do and I can Google them. So you should be aware of what they do and what kind of functions they provide. And another important one is responsive design. These days, responsive design is mostly controlled through CSS. So being able to utilize the media queries and also being aware of some of those popular sizes for phone, tablet, and desktop, and what are some of the strategy you should use for applying those media queries. Those are definitely things that you want to be aware of. So those are good things to talk about. So for HTML and CSS, I think these are some of the basic fundamentals that you should be aware of to go into an interview and to be able to talk about confidently. So yeah, definitely take a look at these. And I will be providing the slides in the Slack channel afterwards. So you can definitely take a look at it more afterwards. Oops. Oh, so a good one. So I did talk about, there are a lot of topics on this, and there's some really, I'm sorry, my mouse is like going up and down really fast. So there are a lot of topics on this, but there's one that you should like really master. Like this is the layout you should like really like know how you can just like make this thing like at 5 in the morning, have not slept in 72 hours. Yeah, I can just make this layout real quick. So this is called the Holy Grail. It is actually on the Wikipedia page as a Holy Grail. And it's a popular layout, and it was definitely more popular in the 90s and 2000s. The sidebar has gone away a little bit, but this is a really basic layout that you should be able to construct. So have a header and have a second row with 3 columns and have a footer, and be able to add elements. You'd be able to like, add a menu to have unordered list and some list items, be able to center something, be able to provide a paragraph, be able to provide like, those 2 ads, which means 2 divs next to each other on top of each other. Try to make this under 10 minutes using Flexbox or CSS grid system, whatever layout that you are system that you're familiar with. Because to be able to make this, it means that you only need to know very basic fundamentals of the CSS. You don't need anything extra. You don't need to know any kind of Z index stacking context. You don't have to manipulate any of that. No transform transitions. So try to get this down and make this in about 10 minutes. So
today at work. I built exactly this today at work.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a common layout. And you should be, as a front engineer, like it doesn't require like many like a crazy thing. You should be able to like put this down and get it going. You can do it in, I actually suggest make this both in React or whatever framework you're familiar with, or just a vanilla JavaScript and CSS. So actually, what am I talking about? Excuse me. You don't need JavaScript for this. However, if you want to make it in React, go for it. But I strongly suggest to make this statically and just straight up use HTML and CSS in like CorderPad. So
yeah, there's no reason for React here if you're not already React.
Yeah. And so this exercise, I'll take a look at it. Just Google Holy Grail. Just have to make this layout. It's a common layout. All right. So let's move over to some of the JavaScript fundamentals. So I can tell you this will be if I'm interviewing somebody, this is the most important part. You have to know JavaScript. You have to learn you have to speak the language. This is how we talk to our computer. This magical machine that's sitting in front of me, that's like displaying all the slides. It has a picture of like people. It shows me Adrian, Conrad. This magical machine that does all of this, we need to talk to it. And this is the language that we really talk to, specifically how we talk to our browser. And as a front-end engineer, like that's your playground. It's the browser. So you need to know how JavaScript actually really works. And which means learning like scope and closure. Closure is an important one, just the fundamentals. And this one, I've seen people trip up on this a lot. Context. Bind, call, apply, and this. So JavaScript provides first-class functions, which means that you can treat a function as something as simple as a variable or a string or an object and pass it around however you want. And JavaScript provides a really powerful tool around that concept with bind, call, and apply, and being able to set a context for that function, which means that you can just have a function defined and just create it somewhere. And you can attach an object to any function, any object to any function, anytime, whatever you want. And this is the tool that JavaScript provides to you. And so you have an extremely powerful feature of JavaScript that I feel like not many people either utilize or understand. And so this is really, I really suggest that you dig deep into this and get like a full understanding of what's going on. And there's actually a really great article about one of the Operation Code members called named George about this, specifically the concept of this. That's actually where I'm like, oh, I finally understand this now. I will share that article in Operation Code Slack also. And also learning the basics of prototypal inheritance. JavaScript does not it provides a way to conduct object-oriented programming similar to Java or Ruby, but underneath what powers it is the prototypal inheritance and the prototypal inheritance chain that it goes up. And so learning the basics of the difference in between, that's a key concept to understand in JavaScript. And so this is the most important one. I've seen so many people fail this. Callbacks, promises, await, async. I actually created like a separate section just to go into these. I received a question for an Amazon interview, and it was based on callbacks and promises. I modified this question so that it's not the same, it's all different. And I've given this question to other people as a mock interview. I've given it to 6 people, and not a single person has passed it yet. And that's a 5-part question over 45 minutes. So you have like less than 10 minutes to go over each section. And nobody was able to solve it under an hour for that section. And it's a question that if you understand promises and callbacks, like the basic fundamentals, really truly understand them, you should be able to solve them right away. And so that tells me that people don't really understand promises and callbacks. So I posted some really good questions that you can try out for this. And that is implementing, I did this for work. Try to implement promise.allSettled. Do I have it on the next? I didn't take it. So promise.allSettled it was just released. Has it been released at EC 2020? Did it come out yet? I know it was a stage 3 and it was a candidate. No. So it might be as part of the standard library now, or it might not be. But there was a time that promise.allSettled was not offered. So promise.allSettled means that when you so what promise.all does, the current existing implementation promise.all, if a single promise rejects, the entire thing is rejected. So you can't just provide an array of promises and get a result from, like, if only it's a sum of them. So think of promise.allSettled as a promise.sum. If some promise settle, then return those. So after everything settles, including errors, anything gets rejected or resolved, return all of them in a set of results. So in implementing, you can just Google promise.allSettled, you get an MDN, implement the API of it, and try to implement that on your own. Same thing with the promise.race. Given a set of promises, make the first one that returns, like the first one that resolves, make that one return. So try to write some of the underlying APIs for promises, and it will give you a much better understanding of how promises actually work. So this is going into like more promises. So this is another question. I will share the link of where I got this question from. This was an actual interview question given to somebody. So I don't know what company, but it was an actual interview question. And the question was, write a function called async.series. And what this does is it takes a series of promises or callbacks. Instead of callbacks here, but it's going to use to be promises. And it executes them sequentially. So let's say this callback had a timeout of 1,000, and the second one had a callback of 500. Technically, the second one should resolve first, and it will be console logged as 2-1. However, what you want to do is write a function, write a function that will guarantee the order of the array that you supplied. So after the callback, even if it was executed like 1 second later, and this one was 500 milliseconds, it will still give you 1 and 2. So try to implement this thing. This will again teach you a lot about callbacks and all of this. And I can tell you right now, I'm going through an extremely hard code at work right now. This one's spinning my mind. It goes in deep with so many callbacks and promises. So this is what you're expected to, let's say, implement as a front-end engineer. And I would actually love to give this as an interview question. I am currently writing a polling function that polls the backend. And if the result is available in 40 seconds, then I download. If not, keep polling. If at any moment I receive a 503 server unavailable, so the server is busy processing the unit, then I switch over to exponential and backoff and retry mode, where I give it so exponential and backoff retry is a strategy you take if the server is unavailable to take your request. And if you're writing a polling function, which which connects to the backend every second, every 3 seconds. If the server is unavailable and can't process your message, it's just all going to get queued up. And if you don't have a dead letter queue and storing all of that, it's just going to be spilled over and get lost. Those requests are going to be gone. So to be able to account for all of those, you need to provide a backup and retry jiggle function is a really good way to account for that. Meaning, you wait 1 second, you connect. Oh, server says you're busy. Then the next time you wait 2 seconds, then you connect. Then afterwards, you double it 8 seconds, 16 seconds, 32 to give the server some staggered time and to be able to provide them with more. If it's not functioning, to actually give it some time to mitigate itself and fix itself. So writing functions like that, you do need deep understanding of JavaScript and how promises work and how things are returned and so right now the actual functionality hasn't been too bad. It's the error handling and making sure the proper error gets passed to the right places that's been difficult for me. And so those are all the tricky things, and knowing how to write something like Async Series will help you with some of the more challenging front-end code that you'll have to write. So, and what I actually just talked about, that's actually kind of tied into the system design portion, which I'll get into later. How you actually design, like in the bigger design, how things to talk to each other. So those are the JavaScript frameworks, JavaScript fundamentals, and I'm going to into some of the front-end frameworks. So if you interview at Amazon, you will not be testing on frameworks. We don't care. We're going to expect you to come in and pick up a framework from scratch within like a week. Like, it doesn't matter if you have not seen React before. You better learn it in a week. I'm sorry, but that's exactly how Amazon rolls. And when people say Amazon is tough, that's exactly what they mean. So we don't even test for you. We quite simply just leak code. It's because you're going to have to learn a whole new framework. I'm inheriting a backbone package next week. So I'm just going to go in and just learn backbone. I have to learn JSP, so I'll just go learn JSP. So, however, so those are some companies that won't test you on frameworks, but that doesn't mean there are many companies that are specifically looking for somebody who can come in and provide great output right away. And in that case, they're going to want to see that you're proficient with the stack they're using. And that's actually the majority of the company. So for the majority of these companies, know the stack that you're going to be working with. So if you, so what is it? One of the best ways to do that is reading the official documentation. Go to reactjs.org. Man, I think I read it like 10 times, like top to bottom, like front to back. Like that is the best documentation out there. Read it. And I would imagine, I don't know Angular nor Vue. They're obviously popular, and I'm sure they have good official documentation. So follow them, and also follow some newsletters. I found cooperpress.com to have some of the best newsletters and some of the this framework kind of news. The new React. I knew nothing about React Suspense until CooperPress told me. So things like that is a really good way to keep up with some of the latest things happening with it. So actually, I kind of just mix it up there. So what I meant to say is that learn to fit like that. Be confident with the fundamentals. Get used to official documentation. Read all the frameworks, but also be aware of some of the features that are coming out of the frameworks. Like some of the latest things, like when the hooks come out. You might want to be when hooks came out back in the day. That's when I started interviewing at the time. So I actually looked into hooks a little bit, so I'm aware of what I need to interview on. Shoot, I got 5 minutes. I've been rambling, and I knew I was gonna go over. I knew this. Oh man! All right. So front-end ecosystem. So like npm, Webpack, and Babel. So the only important thing that I really want to get in with this is transpilation. The whole point of transpilation exists to deal with IE 11. For compatibility and legacy browser support, we have to transpile our code. And it is so painful. And it is so hard. Like, it is such an annoying process to do. So we have Webpack for it. So yeah, like the whole Sas. So when you're using like SCSS, yeah, that doesn't work in the browser. Browser doesn't know what that means. It needs to translate and understand it. So Webpack will be a build system that will take the CSS, transpile it, so that's something the browser can understand. And same thing with Babel, it will take a ES6 plus that IE 11 can understand and transform into the code that the legacy browsers can understand. And so that's what build system and transpilation. It's not that I specifically don't think that you should know Webpack and Babel, but you should know what transpilation does and why it's needed as a front-end engineer. Because so much of what we do is compatibility. So let's go into system design portion. So we're going to skip performance, just no critical rendering path and defer async loading. Just learn about those. So system design is a little bit different for the front end from the back end design. So I suggest that you go through grokking the system design interview. Because I think that's the most popular tutorial. Learn how to build a Twitter or Instagram. Those are the basic back end state management questions. Those are great to know, but for front end, it's a little bit different. And there's no set template on what you may be expected to, how you should approach it. In my opinion, you should approach it with your experience. Things that you have worked on the front end that is applicable to whatever the question that you may have. Let's say design Amazon homepage. So how would you design Amazon's homepage as a front end developer? So I would think about what do I want to server-side render and client-side render? I want our users to be able to get the details paid as fast as possible. So what is some of the data that I can fit on the server side that can be provided on the server side that can just transmit directly? The user connects to the Amazon server immediately on the server, the first response they receive, they have all the information they need. However, what if there was a drop down on the page that you can select a seller from, some item. And let's say it contained every single seller from Amazon. I think that thing's gonna be huge, huge. Are you gonna put all that data onto the server-side render, initial server-side render? No, you're gonna have to probably write some kind of client-side render code, client-side code that would go out and fetch that data. So let's say you're fetching this data. Then when you're fetching it, so let's say on the first click, somebody opens this drop-down. That means on that first click, it's going to be loading and fetching the data, which means there's going to be about half a second or even a second delay in fetching the initial results. So that means that you probably should have made the first set of 50 results already built onto the server-side render, and only the next 50 results are pasted in. So those are some of the approaches that you can think about on so this is, yeah, that's okay, they're putting Amazon a homepage. That's just one of the routes that I'm taking with this. So that's whatever the problems that you've worked on the front end, I'm trying to take that and try to go down that route and explain upon it. So that's a specifically problem that I'm resolving right now, that I'm trying to solve for Amazon for my own project. That's why I went down that route. Or for Oscar, who deals with a really, really complex state management. I'm sure you have plenty to talk about that one. So he moves a lot of data to the front end. So keeping all that state is really important. And state management is really, really important because that's at the heart of the front end. It's a state machine. The front end of the browser is a state machine that goes from one state to another based on any kind of external input. So you have one state, and if there is no input whatsoever, that state in the page does not change. If you leave a page open, then it will never change. Nothing will ever happen until a user does something to it, or there's an external input coming in. This is a data source. Let's say there's a WebSocket push request coming in that makes you reload or something. Unless something like that happens, or a user clicks on something, that state does not change. And there's a whole system involved, like a Redux, to deal with that state. And so being able to talk about state, okay, users on this page, are they in a log state or logged out state? What should be presented to them? How should they go in a tree? Certain things, so their customer information, how are they stored? When they conduct a certain action, when they click this to add to cart, how does that get stored into some state somewhere? So that's some of the things you want to go into. And all right, so it's 8 o'clock and I should stop. And I'm sorry, Kyle, but I'm just going to go 5 minutes, go really fast. So asset delivery. So it comes down to assets that are CSR. Some assets you want to put in a CDN so it delivers fast to the user. And some assets, it needs to be dynamically generated, so it has to get fetched from the origin. So being able to differentiate between the two. For Amazon, some of the banners and some menu items, they can probably store an asset. Some of the advertisements they have, it will probably have to be dynamic. And so those are some of the things that you want to go into. And again, this one, rely on your experience as a front engineer, some things you have done. And if you're an entry level, you're not going to get this question. So don't even worry about it. So, yeah. All right. So HTTP, yeah, just learn get posts, requests and responses, learn how to read them and learn about cores. And this is the component exercise one that I really, really want to go into because this is what in the end kind of got me a job. So I was in panic. So I actually didn't do that much front end. Like I said, I didn't touch HTML and CSS for a while. And all I prepped was leak code. So for Amazon, I interviewed for an STE position, but the strong recommendation, I switched over to the front end with the interview loop. And I had to do an extra front end the interview loop. And which means I have to study for leak code and this at the same time. So it's like double the work. And what I did was I created a list of all the components that I wanted to make. And this is not all of it. I didn't make all of these, but these are some of the ones that I made.
This could be a talk unto itself.
Yeah, definitely. Even each of them can be a talk of its own, how to make them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So being able to make forms. We are, in the end, we make so much CRUD apps because that's the business function. What our business function, what provides value and what generates money is CRUD apps.
Hey, Kevin, what does CRUD mean?
Oh, so there's create, read, update, delete. It's basically, so you have a set of data in the backend, and this is a way to interface to control and modify and update that database. And we obviously on the front end, what we're doing is gathering user input, and we're updating the data in the backend using the CRUD interface. And so, yeah. So, and how do we gather user input? Forms. There you go. Try to make some complex forms. It's really annoying. Get the, even like debound some inputs. You have to put some validations on it, put some string validation, time validation, date validation. I promise you, thing gets really hairy and messy real quick. Feel the pain. So learning how to make forms is good. Learning how to make tabs. So let me actually switch over. So this is what I did to prep for it. I actually don't like Bootstrap. I don't use Bootstrap, but I did go to Bootstrap and I looked at what are some of the popular components. And I looked at, so I made like a little navbar. You should know how to make a navbar from scratch. You can use HTML, CSS, or React or whatever frame you're composed with. Also, pagination components. I can't even, oh my God, I've made so many pagination components. At this point, I can kind of like do the math in my head now. Whenever I started this and they could build this page count minus blah, blah, blah. And try writing a pagination components so you can just scroll through. Progress bar, hey, this is mine. So when I was having one of my POC demos, my director asked me, this was a POC phase, not production phase. So Kevin, how are you dealing with the progress bar? And I just told him, so this was a POC, I'm just gonna pull the back end and just update it. Didn't really talk about it. Getting into the production side, it is so difficult to provide an accurate representation of the backend state to the user in convenient, in timely and actually usable manner, but it's actually meaningful. That's been really hard. So try making a progress bar and actually try to hook it up to the backend. There was one more. Oh, I thought there was a tree style browser here. But try to make a tree style browser. What I mean by tree style browser, oh, this is Amazon code, but this tree style browser, try to give it some static code and go through them. Try to make a file folder browser out of them. And also try making a stopwatch and clock. So you'll have to really, really understand like set timeout and set interval to be able to construct a clock. You don't have to make this like graphically fancy, like things moving, just to have like 0001, 0002, things playing on there and be able to start and stop it. So start making, try making a clock. Actually, it's tricky. It can definitely get tricky. And try making a calendar. This is a really difficult one. You can have a whole team. You can have whole libraries dedicated just for the calendar. But try making like a really simple one. Progress meter, pagination meter. So Google Docs, I added it here because this is actually one of the interview questions that I've gotten. So it was not like actually coded out, but my system design question was design Google Docs. So it can actually go into system design portion or component exercise portion. I guess I could put it on the other side too. But Google Docs is a really good one to think about. Specifically, how do you have two users editing on the same document at the same time and have the single source of truth presented to both users in a timely manner? So that's a really, really hard one. So actually, that should be more to the system design one. So those are some of the components that you should look into to prepare for this. I literally rented a car and I drove it up to upstate New York and rented a cabin and stayed up into the woods for 2 days and locked myself in and made these. That's how I prep for my Amazon interview. Oh man.
He's not
lying.
So, I remember him doing that.
Yeah, I can't concentrate. I hate New York. I live next to the subway. It's so loud. I need to study. I'm gonna bomb this interview. I'm gonna fail. I was in panic, and so I drove up there. And on the way there, I'm like, yeah, I got this now. I'm good. I actually feel so much more confident after doing that. And so, all right. So I just went through a bunch of a whole bunch of things right here, and we're gonna transition over to Kyle right now. But at the end of this meetup, we'll definitely set aside some. I've been talking so long. I'm like, I can't talk. We'll set aside time to take in any questions. So, alrighty. Thanks a lot, everyone. And then we're gonna transition over to Kyle, who is a software engineer at Acorns.
Kyle left because
What's up? I am here. I just need to figure out how to do.
How many software engineers does it take to unmute?
Specifically, how many software engineers did it take to go into like a presentation mode in Microsoft Word?
I kid. Kyle smarter.
Wait, did you say Microsoft Word?
Yes.
Oh no,
I'm coming at you. Don't worry, I'm gonna share the document after. Okay, I can share the screen. Oh my God. Sharing screen. There we go. You guys see this? Wait, not yet. There you go. Now you see it?
Yep.
Yeah, there we go.
Big enough?
I think so.
Just zoom in a little bit. Zoom in a little more.
Oops, that was not what you wanted. That's also not what you want. How's that?
It's good enough. Go for it. Yeah, just go for it.
Let's do it. There we go. I got real estate. All right. So yeah, my name's Kyle. Work at Acorns. Do pretty web things. Been working with Operation Code for a long time. And I'm going to talk to you guys about front-end web development testing. It's a really contested topic with a lot of people that mean well in terms of trying to get coverage up. But maybe don't understand that, like, you know, tests take effort and a lot of time, and it takes companies money to maintain and write tests. And so when you write a test, you should be knowledgeable, you should be intentional. And I think this document helps people try to understand like when and where and how to write tests and to come up with good reasoning for why they're making the decisions that they are. So I've got this document, which I will share after, so don't worry too much about reading as I go through. This is mostly for me to get a prompt to go through. So the first topic I'm going to cover is snapshot tests, mostly because it's really often abused. In the land of front-end web development and coding in general, people like to chase coverage. I want you all to know and hear it from me that chasing coverage is stupid. Don't do that. There's no number that's going to give you confidence in your code base. Instead, you should understand, again, with the intentionality of how you're writing tests, that you will know when you feel confident. For example, you might not have unit tests on a bunch of array utilities. But if you test a bunch of pages that use those array utilities and everything's rendering fine, then you should have confidence in that function, but you might not have 100% coverage. So don't worry about that. In that regard, snapshot tests are often abused as a way to quickly ramp up coverage because basically it just renders exactly what would appear in the DOM as like a fake output, assuming that you pass your component a bunch of props that make it render properly. There is a time and place for snapshot tests, and I just want to talk about it so that you don't go abusing it in the wrong manner. So I write here that there's a few times where it's okay to use it. Low-level components, I'm talking really small ones here, like buttons, very basic inputs, maybe like a pill. You know, you've seen those kind of pill UIs where it's just text and like a rounded border. Those are good times to use snapshot tests because you can quickly catch regressions, and the output that you would see in the DOM is not going to be more than a few dozen lines at most. Views that are really static. So if you have, even if the snapshot's big, but it doesn't change often, it's hard to predict ahead of time when something is or is not going to change often, for example. But I'm sure like even at a place like Amazon, even at a place like Troops, and definitely at a place like Acorns, there are components that I haven't seen change like since I've been there. And you'll kind of figure that out, and it's okay to write snapshot tests there because maybe you're trying to prevent regressions. Even if the snapshot is fairly large. Matching the result of an exact data entry. I think that is trying to assert kind of like things getting munged together. So if you have some kind of like complex form that spits out like an output, and you want to assert that the output is an exact manner every time, that's a good time for a snapshot test, because you can't stand for any regression in that case, right? Every single character needs to be perfect. Functional components that are not very dynamic, that kind of covers the same thing as one. I think they're usually one and the same. The times when you don't want to use snapshot tests. Dynamic components, things that have a lot of props that conditionally render things. For example, if you have some kind of accordion where like you can click it, maybe it's deeply nested and you can click and expand the item multiple times, that's a really bad time to use a snapshot test, because there's so many different pervasive conditions that will change the way that your output is rendered. Entire pages, I have seen it done and I'm really upset that I see that ever. Please don't ever do this. It should be enough said that you don't have to do this, because for one, the snapshot's gonna be so massive that even if you get a diff and your test fails, you'll have no idea what changed it or even how to fix it, because there's no context at all given, because you're just looking at a whole dang page. Deeply nested component structures kind of goes hand in hand with entire pages. If you're familiar with the component container pattern, this would be like containers, for example. You don't want to snapshot containers. Decorated components, because there's a lot of side effects in terms of decorated components. And if you were to, like, for example, with router, if you were to make a snapshot test of like some kind of component that leveraged a router decorator, it's going to render in the snapshot diff a bunch of context about the router, which you frankly don't care about. So my advice to you in this situation would be to export an undecorated instance of your UI so that you can simply pass it props and get it to render how you would expect. What do they look like? Probably should reverse these so people can see what it looks like. Oh, and I forgot to, my bad. I have syntax highlighting on the other screenshots. In fact, I can just switch over really quick. I just converted this to Microsoft Word from PDF. Sorry about the delay here. It's worth it because I don't want you to stare at white text. All right, here we go. So this is the same thing. This is kind of what snapshot tests might look like. So let's say you import some component, you define what the required props are for it to render, and you simply call the toMatch snapshot method from Jest. And then this is what it'll look like when you run the Jest command for the first time. It tells you the snapshot was written. And I'm going to cut back over to here. Sorry for the jarring experience there. You'll get a snapshot and it will look exactly like HTML, essentially. If you're using Enzyme as opposed to React testing library, then it will shallow render things. And instead of looking exactly like HTML, it will look like a mix of JSX and HTML, just for reference. Now, if you, the way that snapshot tests work is that if I make a change and it changes the way the DOM might see the component, then the snapshot will fail until I update it. And typically that's using the command line interface to run the Jest command with the update snapshots flag. But it's very important to note that, as I just said, it's simply one command to update all of your snapshots, jest-u. Know that just because it's easy doesn't mean you just do it. You should be verifying the diff between what your snapshot was and how it changed before you commit, because the whole point of it is to protect against regressions. So if you're just blindly accepting changes to snapshot tests, you provide no value. That being said, this is precisely why snapshot tests are so contentious and so widely hated. These other notes and links are incredibly important. Once I share this, I really hope you consider like reading this document and kind of Googling about snapshot tests, because they're so easy to abuse that they're often abused. And I hope that you, knowing now a little bit better about snapshots and where to use them, will not fall into that pattern. And I hope you're always checking out the diff of a snapshot test. Moving on to unit tests. Unit tests, the brick and mortar, the testing world, I think, and many of us would agree, it's just that they're so simple to write. Why not write them, you know? So typically you want to test things in isolation, and writing unit tests will kind of encourage you to write better code in general, I found. For example, we might talk about pure versus impure functions. The idea of an impure function is it doesn't have all of its concerns isolated inside the scope of the function. And by that, I mean, maybe it references a data structure that's outside of where it's defined. That would be like a side effect that makes the function impure and therefore could do things that you don't expect. So in that regard, writing a unit test is good because it actually doesn't play well with impure functions because you have to take in all the context of that function for it to work. So in that regard, like it might push you to make that function pure. And that's, I think, almost always a good thing. I think everybody would prefer to write pure functions if they could. The only time that they don't is if there's some kind of significant performance win that they can do, or if things are like asynchronous, like they depend on a database, for example. When you should write a unit test, business logic. One prime example of this would be like, so for my company, it's probably better to use something ubiquitous like Amazon. Amazon might have specific unit tests regarding the way things are rendered depending on where you are in the world. For instance, if I'm not, sorry, Kevin, if I say anything incorrectly here, but hopefully they get the point regardless. For instance, you know, Japanese people read things, I believe, from upper right corner down to bottom left. So for example, they could have specific logic around internationalization, changing the way items are rendered. And so for example, that would be a perfect example of business logic, where you're asserting that the order of things matches in the right way, depending on if it's Japanese versus English. Another example might be like for, I will go ahead and use my company. So for Acorns, for example, we have a bunch of different products, and we might render the page that somebody's on in like a different color depending on what product they're looking at. And so that would be another perfect example of a business logic thing. It's not something that's unanimous to all programming. It's something very specific to your company. And so you want to test that and make sure that you're not falling into any bad practices there. Utility methods like everything Lodash ships, for example, is definitely covered under this. They have a bunch of simple unit tests, which, you know, cover the broad scope of things because they're all simple and what's referred to as there's a term for being responsible for one thing and one thing only. That's a great example of most utility methods, and it's a prime example of something you want to add unit tests for. Component methods, that might mean methods that if you're writing class-based React, that might be methods that you bind to the component. Or if you're writing in hooks, this could be like writing a unit test for a hook. I provide even a little bit more context right here. So for example, if you connect a component to Redux, maybe you mock Redux and just assert that like Redux methods are called when they're meant to be called. Interactions with the components, I provide like the pretty brick and mortar example, which is like when you write a button component, the first unit test you might write, aside from that it renders. The second unit test you might write is that when you click the button, the on-click handler gets called. That's a very simple unit test, and it also provides a lot of value. So like, why not write it, you know, because if your unit test catches that like your button doesn't have the on-click button, the on-click handler being called, it's a huge problem, and you'll be really glad that you caught it. Don't use, this is a section on when to not use unit tests. I would say very simply, I'm going to try to speed up here. Very simply, glue code, that would be like, don't test Redux connected components. Instead, what you'll want to do is, again, earlier I recommended with a decorators, it's the same exact paradigm. Export an unconnected component that you can just pass props to and test in isolation. And then also export the Redux connected component so that you can use it in your integration code. Entire pages would fall under an example if I wouldn't write unit tests for that. And a very important and pivotal topic that you might face subjective criticism over. My opinion is that you shouldn't be writing tests that assert things that well-tested third-party code is doing. For example, why would anybody test that Redux is doing its job? Like, they have plenty of unit and integration tests on their own to prove that Redux does its job correctly. So you should just focus on the fact that your interactions are working, that your actions are firing at all in the UI where you expect them to. In the same sense, you don't want to test that when you hit a keystroke in a formic form that the keystroke actually populates the input. That's silly. Instead, what you want to assert is that as you fill out a form and you submit, that it submits with the exact data structure that you expect. This is an opinionated take. You might face people that want 100% coverage no matter what. I think they're silly, but that's just my opinion on that. And frankly, if you come across a third-party code base that you want to integrate, but it has no coverage or it's not very popular, I would say why not, if the license allows it, why not just integrate that and write tests for it so you are confident about it? Or make a PR if you're feeling gracious. I know I'm hand waving a lot with business logic. I think I covered it pretty well, but for example, if you have some very specific currency method like this, I've drawn up a simple example. This is just JS docs. You can just comments, you can ignore those. If I'm using numeral to do some kind of math around formatting and or rounding of some currency, then I can write a very quick example and assert that when I pass it this figure, I get returned back this figure with the comma. And then I have maybe more tests that pass in this optional rounding function to round it to the nearest tenth, for example.
Hey, Kyle?
Yeah.
I'm still just sharing the Word doc. You know that, right?
Yep. Why?
Okay.
Is it the wrong view?
Probably is.
Let me, oh shoot. I hope I haven't. That's so awkward.
Sorry I didn't call that out earlier.
No, I appreciate it. Oh boy. Okay. Well, I'm glad that I was talking through the topics, but anyways, this is the code base that I was showing. You can see it now, correct, right?
Yes, all good.
Yep.
Okay, good. So if I've got some method that formats currency in some opinionated manner, then I can write an assertion for it. For instance, it converts to a comma format when I do this. And I could write another test where I pass in the optional rounding function and it will round in the certain way I want. This would be a good example of business logic and a great example of a unit test. I have some links here to some simple unit tests like array utilities and object utilities and string utilities. I have examples of testing for selectors, Redux selectors. And then React testing library has, these are tagged to an older version, but you can probably go to the same folder on the latest version and you'll find examples of tests, how you should be testing dispatches in conjunction with user interactions, like a button click might fire a Redux dispatch versus like form interactions, for example. My favorite aspect of testing would be integration tests. I link a video here and I encourage you all to watch it. It's the lead engineer and founder of Cypress talking about integration testing with an opinionated take. And while he is indeed platforming to sell Cypress to a conference full of QA and software engineers, it's also a very principled and opinionated take on integration testing that has led me with no wrong ever. It's been life changer since I watched this video, honestly. So I declare it a must watch and I encourage you guys to watch it. The idea is with Cypress or Test Cafe or Applitools or whatever end-to-end or integration testing framework that you use, that you're testing pages and containers in a manner that makes sense from behavior. In other words, behavior-driven development. Maybe you don't write the tests first, you can still write them later, which would go against BDD, but the idea is that you shape tests not in a manner that makes sense to developers, but in a manner that makes sense to users, because if you're testing your code base in a way that your users would understand, then you'll be able to ship things more confidently because it'll be working for the users. You'll want to use integration tests when you're testing view-to-view interactions. For instance, a redirect after submitting a form, a modal opening, like maybe you have like a COVID-19 response modal that you want to display when somebody visits for the first time, and then like local storage like shares that, hey, they visited the page and they already saw this modal, so you don't need to show it again. That kind of interaction can be tested. Successful authentication of a user. And that video will go over it, but one opinionated take to ensure that your test coverage isn't like doubled down on over and over and over again. One big mistake people do with integration end-to-end testing is that they log in with the login form before every single test. That's really over the top. You should be doing that once, and then you should just imperatively be calling whatever endpoint that you need to do to like manually get the token and just slap it on there, because there's no reason you need to get test coverage the correct way more than once, especially not X number of times for every single integration test you have. Instead, assert that you can log in correctly as the user would expect once, and then just hack your way into logging in and your integration tests for the remainder. Unless, of course, the other tests depend on authentication in some way. For example, if you're updating a profile or if you're trying to request deleting accounts. Testing complex and stateful components like calendars, like widgets, like forms. These are all perfect opportunities for integration testing frameworks. Cookies being set, local storage, window. The only time that you shouldn't be using integration testing frameworks is in the manner where you just kind of like navigate the page. Like, okay, user went to home page and it made an assertion about the home page. Then he logged in. And then after he logged in, then he went to this other page and he checked something out. That's going to be really, really brittle for a lot of different reasons. Stick to doing no more than like 1 or 2 page transitions, and then just create a new test if you need to. And the idea is that through a series of 1 and 2 page interactions, you'll develop a very comprehensive network of coverage regarding a few shallow integrations that will give you confidence enough that the full spectrum of coverage is very simple to test in terms of like maybe 1 manual QA run. I also touch on visual regression tests, which are pretty sweet, but also very difficult to implement correctly. I just want you to be aware of them, but I would probably shy away from these until like you're getting paid and like somebody asks you to set this up, because this view right here is actually really hard to nail because there's a lot of flakiness in a lot of different ways apps can be written. And then you might be getting into this problem where you like up the confidence interval over and over and over just to get the test working. And yeah, it's not, the technology is not quite there yet, but it is getting there. There are a lot of tools as a service, like Applitools, Chroma UI, and Percy, but they don't encourage page visual regression tests. They encourage that for like component libraries, like side by side with Storybook, for example. End-to-end tests, psych, never do those. A lot of UI thought leaders pretty much think those are out of our wheelhouse. And if they are to be done, they should be done by somebody else, basically. Because if you're doing all the above correctly, chances are you might not even need these. And if you do, it's probably going to be a very simple subtask that you're probably not even doing. And I'm going to stop at the opinionated standards because those aren't important to go over. I will say that there are a bunch of standards that you can integrate in terms of your test code. And if you do decide to stick to some kind of standard, I encourage you to lint that standard. There is no point in having some kind of style or code standard that you can't automate, because that's annoying as hell. And that's it for me.
Wow, right on the dot at 8:30.
A lot of questions. I don't know if we want to like go over these. Anything that I should look at?
So yeah, let's do a closing right now, and then we'll start taking questions for anybody who wants to stay afterwards.
Sure.
So yeah, yeah, thanks everybody for dropping by today. Hope you were able to like learn anything new that, you know, hopefully we're able to provide any kind of help to you on your journey as a front-end engineer, or just like in the software engineering in general. So we will be sharing our documents, the slides that I went over and what Cal is going over. We will be sharing an Operation Code. Unfortunately, there's no direct link to join Operation Code Slack. You have to come to our website, fill out the information, and put yourself as a volunteer, and you will be emailed the invite link. And through that link, you should be able to find it. Not sure exactly where to share it yet. Come over to the New York City channel, NYC. So NYC channel, let me type that in right now. Once you come to join the channel Operation Code, we'll have the documents there. So Oscar, do you have anything you want to add and something with Evans?
No, I got nothing. Yeah, thanks everybody for, I was going to say coming out tonight, but thanks everybody for logging onto the call. There were a lot of really great questions, and definitely please come over to the Slack, as Kevin said, and pick up that conversation there. We got a lot of other smart people with a lot of experience in the industry, just ready to answer your questions.
Yeah. So for hopefully our next one, we're gonna have it locally. We'll see how it goes, what happens within a month or so. But for our next one, we're planning to have it with Google, and after that one, it should be Amazon. So those are the lineups we had planned, but unfortunately, this virus thing came up, so a lot of the plans changed. But meanwhile, we'll see if we'll do another virtual meetup. And also, yeah, thank you very much for coming out tonight, everybody, and thank you very much for speaking, Conrad. And everyone, so we're gonna end it now. But if you want to stay afterwards and ask any questions, we'll be sticking around. So, yeah, thank you very much. All right. So, for the questions, should we go through? Let's scroll up. What are some of the questions that we should take?
Let's see. We've got 32 people left still on. I think at this point, we're probably going to best be able to answer questions in Slack, actually, because there we'll also be able to crowdsource.
Yeah, but I don't want everybody to I just want to be able to have a conversation. So any question, people can just ask any kind of question now. If you have any questions, ask away. Because we just went through my talk, Kyle's talk, Oscar's talk. So if anybody have anything, just post in the chat.
Christian asked, where do you guys recommend starting to apply to jobs? At what point can you go out and try? There's so much to learn that you'll never be truly ready, it seems. I mean, I'd say, yeah, it definitely feels that way, right? We're all at risk of putting ourselves against an unrealistic standard, feeling like we have to know everything before we can ever begin. And, I think if we take a step back and, look at it as if, we were talking to somebody else instead of ourselves, it becomes pretty clearly not true. I work with a bunch of really brilliant developers, and they all have blind spots. They all have things that they don't know. I have plenty of things that I don't know, and I still go to work every day and get stuff done and provide value for my company and receive a good paycheck in return. They knew I didn't know everything when they hired me. Same with all of my colleagues. So that specific part of it, the feeling of, that you're never going to be ready, I kind of want to dispel the myth that you have to know everything before you get started. Certainly there's a minimum level of knowledge and competence that you need to have, but that's going to vary, and it's probably not exactly where you think it is.
Right.
Yeah. So, Kevin, do you have any thoughts about where to apply?
I like personally, so everybody's got different takes on this, right? In terms of where you should be applying. I'm sure like Kevin, for example, would be advertising for Fang. I'm a big fan of smaller startups. I know Built-in has a big presence for New York. Going off of that list, going off of Angel list, which is angel.co. Those are good lists. Also reaching out to seniors in the city, asking here is a good question, but also continuing to go to meetups and just asking there. I myself being really well connected, and I'm actually in Portland, Oregon. I just maintain a list of my favorite companies, so that anybody asks me, I just send them a plain text list. So you might have somebody like that equivalent in New York in person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
oh, I was gonna go into the next question that was on there, but yeah, to summarize what everyone's saying, yeah, it's don't really know when you're going to be ready. It's going to kind of keep going, and you don't have to know everything. You just have to like be aware of things. Even just being aware of some of the things we're talking about today will get you really far.
Yeah.
So, so one of the questions that was on there was, what's the best resource for learning CSS? Making stuff. Making stuff. That's really getting your butt kicked. Trying to make something look exactly like how it looks.
Yes.
And so here's the thing about people, like, don't sit there and think like, oh, I have to like design something new and make something cool that's gonna like, it's a surprise people. No, just even do the most basic thing you can think of, copy it. Go to Bootstrap and copy it. See if you can make it look exactly the way it is and like replicate it. That's
the job for most of us, right? Like we don't design our stuff most of the time. We get handed designs from a designer. We have a conversation with the designer. We push back on it, whatever. There's feedback and everything from us. That's expected. But most of the work is implementing what the designer gave us. You don't design this.
Can I clarify?
Yeah.
My question is more in terms of like learning CSS, like best practices, you know, like mobile first, or start doing CSS right from the beginning.
Gotcha.
Not necessarily about how to use grids or CSS grids or using
Flexbox,
Flexbox, but more so like where do you go to find kind of like, you know, documentation for how to do great CSS?
That's actually a really good question. It's been through experience. Mine's been through mentorship. There was a really good front engineer who taught me. So CSS Tricks has a lot of good resources. That's the definitive place I go to learn anything about CSS. Their Flexbox that paid. Like I just have it like bookmark. But that's actually a really good point. And if somebody knows a good resource for the best CSS practices, I feel like a community like that must exist. I look around CSS Tricks. They have a lot of articles about like how to write good CSS, and I'm wondering if they're going to cover those topics. So
yeah, I mean, like the core things that I would think of with CSS that are like, these are the things you should know that have best practices around them that, you know, aren't covered by tools so much as they are by how you construct your CSS, or, you know, I'm thinking about layouts and responsiveness and accessibility.
Yeah,
and layouts and responsiveness are pretty deeply tied together, but you know, accessibility is kind of its own concept, and those are the things that were part of it. There is documentation out there, in particular for accessibility. I mean, the W3 standards are out there. You can, or the WCAG standards are out there. You can read that, and there are accessibility scanners that will go over whatever website you've created, your personal little app, or, you know, you can scan google.com. You can do their Chrome extensions. You can log them in and check out your app. That stuff is really helpful and sort of guides you towards best practices right there. As far as responsiveness and layouts, yeah, I don't necessarily have like a number one resource that I turn to, but experience has taught me a fair bit.
Yeah, I think in terms of like layout, one thing I want you all to know is layouts themselves are a tough topic because even like senior engineers like aren't getting it right, or aren't getting it right in a way that like works forever or is scalable in some sense.
Yeah.
I honestly still think Kevin's recommendation on just building shit applies here. To that end, you can add a slight adjustment to say like, make it a practice where maybe you look at just the desktop view of Airbnb when you make the Airbnb clone, except you have to make it also look good, air quotes, for mobile. And often that's like a good enough exercise for you to start figuring out, oh, okay, well, I can use Flexbox, and I can use like a media query that switches flow direction from like row to column. And like, that's one way I can make things look better. Mm-hmm. And you'll start to learn through just practice. And honestly, that's probably not going to be right for a long time, if ever. And the places that do the best design systems are the ones that define like layout setups early. and make them rigid and uniform. But good luck finding places like that because they're far and few between.
I think
So
definitely the experience is going to be a big one. I think I don't know about any resources, but I can share two things that have been incredibly useful for me. So when you're in prod, everything needs to be uniform. And so like your margins for all your buttons need to be exactly the same. So in your styles, you should have very little hard-coded numbers. Like in your styles, you'll have some sort of like spacing dot JS or whatever. And that is just going to be like small, medium, large, extra large. Those are your numbers. And so you import that into your style sheet. And so everything is going to have the exact same sort of spacing everywhere. And if anything changes ever, you just go to the sizing. You change it there and it'll change everywhere. And so that's one of the better practices. Another thing is in the beginning, it's very easy to style everything. Every component, you're going to throw like 30 styles on one thing, sort of like a class. And then you're just going to add the class and it's going to be styled in that way. Try to break it down where you can make it a lot more modular. So you'll have a thing that just adds a border width of 2 and then like a border radius of 5. And then like styles could take like an array. So it's going to get that border radius 2, the border radius 5, the border width of 2, and then you add more styles on top of it. So anywhere else that has that same exact border, that look, you just add that in, and that makes it a lot more modular. That has been incredibly helpful for consistency and just modularity of your CSS.
Yeah, thinking about
Should
style.
we be using libraries like Bootstrap, or should we be writing from scratch?
So
Learning still, I definitely say
Do
do
not.
not use those libraries.
don't
Okay.
use them. Do not.
Like if you are comfortable with CSS or if learning CSS is not a goal of yours, that is, you do not want to be a front-end developer. Maybe you're a back-end developer that just needs a quick UI for something you're building. Fine, go ahead, use the component library, use the UI kit. If your work is requiring you to throw up like a quick proof of concept or a throwaway piece of code, hey, yeah, all that stuff is valid. But if your goal is to learn how to write CSS, learn how to be a competent front-end developer, that's gonna kill your progress.
I actually had an argument with the free code camp community about this. I went to one of their meetups. They had an argument because they have Bootstrap in free code camp, and I strongly disagree that Bootstrap should be on there.
Hey, App Academy West Coast used to teach Bootstrap, and you know
Why? That's wrong.
I mean, a lot of the online courses use Bootstrap, or
They shouldn't.
well, the thing is, like the idea with a boot camp, and this is, you know, obviously I went through a boot camp, I taught at a boot camp, I'm pro boot camp. But the idea with a boot camp is to get you work ready as soon as possible. That's different than making you a fully like a holistically competent developer.
But the thing is that they're not necessarily be working on Bootstrap. So I think it'll make them better job ready by teaching them the fundamentals. They can be ready to pick up a Bootstrap, you know, whatever framework they need to.
And I agree, but the market on the West Coast at the time that App Academy West Coast was teaching that was such that Bootstrap was basically ubiquitous. So that was the decision at the time. We ultimately ended up changing that, based partly on the strength of my argument and partly on the strength of the market changing. Regardless, you know, you will see this in a lot of places. Obviously, Kevin and I will share this opinion. A number of others I see also share that opinion here. Using these kits are not going to be good for your learning, and they're often not good for production web apps either.
And I actually disagree with Kevin, because I think, so for instance, for Free Code Camp, like Bootstrap's recommended after 600 hours of prior education in just vanilla CSS. And I think there's an important lesson in learning to interface with like third-party libraries that you didn't write, especially one as pervasive as Bootstrap. I think their main idea is to get you to do things besides styling for projects that come afterward.
I see.
And I think it's important to note, but at the same time, I agree with Kevin in the sense that like you shouldn't be using Bootstrap as a crutch once you learn it. It's important to get the fundamentals down.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, being able to utilize a new thing. But however, it should not be a primary learning resource for learning CSS. You should learn CSS
Oh,
on
agreed.
its own.
Definitely agreed.
Yeah.
So then, if anybody else has questions, feel free to jump in. But then what about learning Sas or?
You should eventually, but learn vanilla CSS first, and then learn how to use Sas.
I
For
actually
3 years
disagree
now.
with that. I think that Sas is ubiquitous enough now that you know, like styled components exposes a Sas-like syntax. It's so popular at this point that.
But there's something to be said though, right? Because like, you know, you need to learn about CSS specificity before you just start nesting things randomly in Sas.
That's a great point.
There you go.
That's yep. No, fair enough.
Yeah, but yeah, it's definitely something you definitely want to learn eventually. So.
Yeah.
By the way, just a quick note. So Oscar was the lead instructor of App Academy for New York City, and Evans is the lead instructor for Flatiron School in New York City. So we have a lot of people who has helped a lot of people and taught a lot of people before. So yeah, definitely utilize them. They've known a lot of people who went through alternative path to get into coding.
Yeah, actually, so I left Flatiron School about a few weeks ago.
Oh, I was actually I was thinking, I knew you were talking about it. I wasn't sure if I should say it or not, so I just said it. Said it just you were still there. So you're at the new job? Yeah.
Yeah, so I work pretty much exclusively in React Native, which is
cool,
which is awesome.
Is
Fun
it?
stuff, man.
I like it. I like it.
I mean, the Stockholm syndrome takes hold.
Congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations, Evan.
Yeah, awesome, man.
Cool. I see. Those were great questions about CSS. Graduated from boot camp, but not sure if I should go for front end, back end, or full stack. Any suggestions?
What do you like?
That's a good one. That's a good response. I mean,
There's nothing wrong with being T-shaped, and there's also nothing wrong with just like keeping it flat until you figure out which T you want to go down.
yeah.
I think most people end up getting T-shaped, and what that is if you like make an upside down T with like your hands or whatever, the idea is the tallest peak is what you're really knowledgeable at. In this case, maybe back end, maybe front end, but you know enough, and you've got a strong base to be dangerous in the back end or something like that. So I think the important thing is to not worry about that too much. I mean, you'll make your decision eventually. Just do what you like, lean towards that.
I feel like the people that I finished App Academy with, my cohort, I would say like half and half for front and back end now. I would say the split is like half and half for like full stacks. So, so also another thing, whatever you start with doesn't mean that it's what you're stuck with. You can pretty much like switch whatever. Like it's not too hard. So, and as a front engineer, so let me explain to you what I do at Amazon. It is what I do at Amazon. My label is front end engineer, but pretty much at any other company, I'll be a full stack engineer. At Amazon, so like Rails, Spring, like Express, that's front end. That's considered a front end. At Amazon, at front end is anything that serves the web, including the host. So you're going to be doing DevOps stuff on the host. You're going to be, so I'm writing APIs. I'm writing Spring APIs. I'm writing Java. So this is what we mean by it at Amazon. We don't test like frameworks. We just expect you, okay, you need to write something in Java, learn Java right now, and learn Spring and write some API, do it in 1 week. Like that's.
Let's be clear that definition of front end
It's different. It's Amazon style.
Full stack, that is the definition of front end you get at enterprise, right? That's not the sort of definition of front end that you would get at the vast majority of companies. The definition of front end that you get at the vast majority of companies would involve you dealing with the exact technologies that we talked about today. Not a single one of us talked about anything on the server aside from server-side rendering, which is we're still talking about.
Yeah. So where I was actually going with this, it's that as a front engineer, you're just going to be, so that one of the layer that I just explained is actually called a middleware in Amazon. You're going to be exposed to that. You're going to learn, you need to know how the backend works if you're going to connect to it and get APIs. So you need to gain understanding from that. And just by doing this, just starting from the front, you can move into the backend by just, okay, can I write an API? Can I just write a route real quick? Can I write a controller? Just from there, you can just transition to the backend. If you're a backend developer, it's like, I'm sick of just updating configs all day and doing database migrations. Can I make a cool component and make it look awesome? You can just easily transition over that way. So I work at Amazon. It's a big place and it's pretty tightly controlled, but I have opportunity to go down that route too.
Yeah, I do think there's an elephant in the room that we need to speak to, which is bias. Particularly for people starting out, particularly if you went through a boot camp and didn't go through a university CS education. And so this is going to be a bias against background and a bias against front-end development. Front-end development is often not respected, not universally, certainly not universally. I've worked with people who have really disrespected it and thought that it wasn't real programming or worthy of real recognition. And I've worked with people who thought it was incredibly difficult, or who knew that it was incredibly difficult and complex, and respected it as an area of expertise that they may or may not have had themselves. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm a front-end developer and I think I'm pretty smart. But I think that if you are worried about, like, well, what am I actually capable of doing? Am I going to be respected, or like maybe am I not smart enough to be a back-end engineer? Or understand that these are actually really respectable subfields in and of themselves, and neither is better than the other. Neither requires more intelligence or competence than the other. They require different kinds of knowledge and somewhat different skills, somewhat. So there's that, and understand that people will try to slot you, people may try to slot you into one or the other based on your background. At the end of the day, it's still up to you. You get to decide what path you want to go down. I chose front end. I came from a theater background, so I like users. Yeah.
Can I ask a question related to that? So I actually went to Flatiron. So Flatiron is very much web development, and it's React front end and then Rails back end.
Right.
But as part of the program, you end up doing a little bit of everything. So to me, it just seems like as a front end developer, you're expected to know so much, like authentication, being able to set up a server, that is all of that stuff. So when you're talking about like finding a job as a front-end developer or a web developer, how much do you need of the stuff that supports what the user sees? So like, how much authentication should we know? How much of, I don't know, hashing?
No auth. Like, don't even worry about auth, like, really.
Yeah, don't worry about it in depth at the very least. You should be able to
focus on the fundamentals, like the fundamentals, HTML, CSS, JavaScript fundamentals that I went over, and some like framework fundamentals like React. Authentication is a specific implementation, and there's a whole other subfield, so you don't really have to go into that kind of specifics.
Right.
Again, the fundamentals is where you want to focus on.
Yeah, understanding how to like use an existing auth implementation is important. But
I don't think they'll be interviewed. So like for interviews or something like that. Like
I've been asked that.
You've been asked
again.
Jesus.
Yeah.
But it would be about like as a junior, like for a junior role.
Mid-level.
Okay, yeah. I wouldn't expect anybody junior to get asked about like authentication, but above that, maybe you were given like system primer, like high level stuff, like.
Like
tokens
all the system stories and all
cookies.
the tokens. Yeah, there's a lot going on. As a junior entry level, I just wouldn't expect that. It might be a plus if they're aware of it, but hell, I don't know anything about it right now. I would have to Google and learn it all over again.
Yeah.
So
I think to answer the broader question, getting away from auth, we talked about all the front end technologies that you need, but I believe in specializing. I do for myself. I don't believe that everybody should specialize. At the same time, while I believe in specialization, I wrote some Scala code today because that's what our backend is in, and I needed something. Ultimately, we're problem solvers. That's what we're paid to do. We're not paid to write React code. We're not paid to write code, really. That's not really what we were hired to do. We're paid to solve problems. And so that's what theoretically you're getting hired to do. As a software engineer, Kyle was talking about that T-shape, right? Like where you go really deep on something. But that's not necessarily the only thing you know. You should be able to spin up a quick and dirty backend if you're a front-end developer. That doesn't mean it has to be the greatest thing in the world. That doesn't mean it needs to handle scale. That doesn't mean it needs to have the cleanest database design. All that it means is that you can deploy something to support the thing that you really care about. And vice versa, right? If you wanted to go the backend route, you should know enough JavaScript and HTML and CSS to create a basic UI. You know, we should be generalists to that extent and specialists about the things that we really care about. That's my take anyway. I know there are a bunch of other things that came up, but I just saw how to be deep on everything. Yeah, nobody is. I mean, I know it's all relative, right? Like, you know, my manager's been doing this for a stupid long time, and I think he's brilliant, and he can talk really, really smartly about a huge variety of things. And so relative to a junior developer, he is really deep on everything. But there are things, you know, he's been doing this 4 times as long as I have. There are things that I know that he doesn't because I've chosen to specialize where he has. I've chosen to specialize in a different area than he specialized, and his general knowledge took him to a certain level where he and I can have intelligent conversations about the stuff that that I specialize in. But he's not going to match me on that, and I won't match him on his stuff. But yeah, nobody knows everything.
So I was hoping to like draw down around like 9 o'clock or so. So how many questions? Do we have a lot more?
Unclear.
Let's take like 1 or 2 more questions if we can.
How important is algorithms and data structures during tech interview? Kevin, I feel like you're best suited to answer that.
Yeah, be prepared for it. Like so at Amazon for front-end position, like you're going to be leak coded, and there are places that will leak code you. By leak code, what I mean is, so there's this one website that where pretty much all of this question comes from. If you interview at Amazon, most likely that question will come from that website. So that's leakcode.com. Be aware that leakcode, it's going to have like an easy, medium, hard. Easy level on LeetCode does not mean easy. It's easy once you have mastered the fundamentals of that data structure and algorithms. So once you're fully proficient, then, then it's an easy problem. But getting to that point of proficiency is difficult and it takes time. But yes, you should know. So the best resource that I know is the App Academy resource, the open.appacademy.io. So App Academy is completely fully free now, and they have an online portion for it. And on that one, they have the algorithm section. That's what I used to study for. This is everything. And also another really good one. I don't know if they still have a sale or not, but if you have a chance to, you should get an interview kit. I've only heard amazing, good, positive things about interview kit. They had a huge sale for $20. So take a look at it again, and I hear it's definitely worth the money. And yeah, definitely check that one out. So learn Algo DS. It will make you a better encoder. As a front-end developer, you're working with a DOM, you're working with a tree, you're working with a graph traversal. Like you're already working with the tree structure in the front end. And so learn how to manipulate that tree.
Yeah, and Kevin has also used this analogy in the past. You studying algorithms and data structures is like going to the gym, right?
Yep.
This is exercise. This is making you better at problem solving, right? So, and I say this as someone who's incredibly undisciplined at practicing this. But I keep a base level competence so that when I do encounter something that can be solved with a particular kind of algorithm or a data structure, at the very least have a well of knowledge I can draw from. So yeah, it's going to be more part of your daily life as a backend engineer than as a front-end engineer. And interviews are starting to reflect that at many companies, including Facebook famously, I think it was last year, changed their interview structure for front-end developers, such that they are no longer getting algo questions or whiteboard.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But they are getting more intensive, like deep in front end, deep in browser land questions.
Gotcha.
Which is interesting and I think very fitting, and is ultimately going to produce the kinds of front end specific engineers that they're looking for. But it also means that they're hiring specifically for front end now, rather than going the Google model and hiring people who are kind of generalists. Facebook does also have a generalist track if you're interested in interviewing there, and that one does involve intensive algorithm whiteboarding questions.
Quick question about that. I think, at least when I looked at it, it said 3 years experience as a developer.
Yeah.
No, none of those. Never ever look at the minimum, the year requirements.
Yeah, I think the position that I am currently occupying had a minimum, it was like 8 or 10 years experience.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Never look at those. It's completely meaningless.
Okay, cool. I just had a bunch of Facebook recruiters, and they sent me, one of them sent me the link, and I saw the experience, and I kind of got this.
No, just apply.
Yeah,
Don't
They'll ask you for more years of experience with a language that hasn't even existed that long. So I wouldn't worry about that.
yeah, remember that these things are written by recruiters, not by people who know the technology.
All right. Thank
And
you.
also know, like, don't bother putting yourself out of a job. Let them do that for you.
That's
Always,
right.
always on the hunt.
Somebody just asked, how did recruiters reach out to you?
Yeah. I didn't have,
LinkedIn.
Yes, that,
LinkedIn.
but I didn't really have any recruiters reach out to me until I'd been working at App Academy for like 6 months with software engineer in my title. So, you know, they weren't coming to me for the period of time that I would have been looking for a job.
Yeah.
Right out of a boot camp. And I think that's okay. Right? Like
I've been attending a bunch of virtual events for people who are interested. There are a bunch of virtual career fairs going on. There's a free code camp event coming up soon. They just had one a couple of weeks ago. And then if you go to the Slack channel for that event or the Discord, there'll usually be a bunch of recruiters posting links to jobs that they're currently hiring for.
There you go. Utilize all of those. That's a great tip.
Yeah. So check them out. I'll try to post them in the Slack when I see them. But even if I can't, because I work full time, so even if I can't attend for the whole day, I'll at least join the Slack channel or the Discord to see like what people are talking about.
Nice. Yeah. I think that, you know, later on in your career, not even that much later on, but like after you've gotten some experience, you're going to have recruiters reaching out to you. And most of them are still not actually going to be helpful. They're mostly going to be a waste of your time. But when you're looking for that first job, don't expect anybody to reach out to you. They're not gonna. If they do, they're probably gonna be full of shit. The important thing here is build your skills and remember it's a numbers game. You're like, you just have to throw a lot of applications out there and expect a tiny return rate on that. So yeah, we used to, this is definitely no longer quite right, but we used to say, or we had an actual stat at App Academy that on average, a graduate had to send out 300 applications before getting their first offer. And that was when the market was really, really strong for junior developers. Imagine sending out 300 applications. We have pretty high standards for the application quality that we were having people send out. So yeah, dude, if you're sending 30, that's nothing. You haven't even started job searching.
Yeah.
I know that must feel like a bummer to hear that, but it's like, because I can imagine the amount of effort that went into 30 applications. You are off by an order of magnitude.
But then how many interviews should we be expecting? Because I'm kind of like, if I get one interview, I just focus on doing my best for that one.
Yeah.
Like, should we be interviewing like 3-4 times a week?
Yeah, so that's my problem too, is that every time I get an interview, I just stop applying for jobs for a week and then I just focus on the interview.
Yeah.
So that's why I want to apply for like, not even 30, probably like 20 jobs, because I'm trying to like pass my interviews too.
You don't stop applying until you start your job.
Yeah.
Because every state is basically, what's it called?
At will.
At will. You can get your job yeeted out from under you. And I've had, like, especially this should be prevalent right now. Some of you, might have faced this being unemployed now. I know of people that had job offers and were ready to move over. And then after all this shindig went down, they just pulled the offer out from under them. Yeah. So you do not stop hunting until you are sitting your ass in a chair at a company and getting a paycheck.
And even then you might want to consider, I mean, like, don't quit, but like consider staying in the interview game. Don't please don't be that person that accepts an offer and then says, you know what, actually, really, that's a terrible idea. At the same time, Kyle's totally right. Like, keep going until you're absolutely sure you have the job and you are in.
Yeah. The other thing is that if you do stop applying and they wind up giving you an offer, you have to really sit and think, like, do I actually want to work at that company? If you're throwing out 300 applications, you're probably going to look at a company like, oh, that company's okay. And then when you're in the final rounds, you meet some people, they might give you a weirdo vibe, but then they gave you an offer. You're kind of in a position where you fight against the desperation of like, oh man, I got the offer. Should I take it? Yeah. Versus like, do I really want to work there? And so
I've seen this happen. I've seen people get desperate and just take offers and regret it.
Yeah.
So keep applying. I've also seen somebody happened in my cohort at the academy. She got a job in a week before it started at AT&T. They canceled the team, and a week before the start date, she lost her offer. So these things do happen.
There are a lot of questions coming in. One of them talked about asking us to share imposter syndrome.
I unfortunately have to sign off, but
there are a lot of questions. So we did want to draw it down by like 9 o'clock or so. It is hard to just answer all of these. Ask these in our Operation Code. Join us. It's a Slack format. We could definitely come back to this asynchronously and post and reply. All of these questions are great, and it'd be great for the community to learn from. So please join us and ask these questions away.
Also, is this a weekly meetup?
No, we typically aim for about every other month right now.
Oh, okay. Cool.
And it's normally in person.
I just joined the Slack, but it's now.
Yeah. So again, we're like military focused, but we're open to everybody. We love getting the connections in between. Also, like half of the members at Operation Code are non-military. So like, don't feel any kind of like discouragement. Join us. So we also have, since you're planning, you're in New York City. So we have local meetups. So this is our first virtual meetup. We like to usually meet at a location. And the next one that we have scheduled is either going to be at Google or Amazon, and we're going to be holding a meetup there. So definitely stop by. And actually, like, let's meet in person.
I can still stay on for a few more minutes if anybody has questions, if y'all want to go. And then, I definitely encourage you to get on Slack.
Yeah. I still need to work. Like, I'm not kidding. Until May 15th, I have no life. I must launch. There's so much I need to do.
Is this your Zoom, so you got to close it down?
No.
This is an opcode Zoom, so I think we're okay.
Yeah, so cool. I'll be good to go. So it'll be on here. So it was really nice seeing everybody today. It was great. Thanks, Oscar, Kyle, and and thanks, Conrad also. And it was nice seeing everybody, and I'll see you all around.
Bye, Kevin.
See you, Kevin. See you, Oscar. Okay, so earlier somebody asked about imposter syndrome. I want you to know that feeling is not invalid, because the thing is, you're going to feel it forever. I mean, I still feel it too. I still feel like I'm behind. I've been at this game for 3.5 years now, and I feel like I do know what I'm doing in some respects, but at the same time, in a lot of ways, like, you just will never feel like you're good enough. And that's okay. Just like tackle that in a way that helps you go to sleep at night. Just know that it's okay that you don't know everything. Just know that you never will know everything. Just get by on the day-to-day knowing that you're trying your best. That's the only advice I really have in regards to imposter syndrome. It's real, and it's probably pretty valid because there's just so much to learn. So then somebody asked, good way to get mock interviews. I think a lot of people will offer in community Slack channels. I know that we offer mentorship for people who are prior military and Operation Code. If there are other communities that you belong to, maybe you're like gender nonconforming, or maybe if there's like, for instance, like Black coders or girls who code or like Asians who code, stuff like that. Like, yeah, exactly. Just go after whatever community looks out for each other, because they're going to be more inclined to give you personalized help because that's their mission.
Can I give you something about that?
Yeah, sure, man.
So I got one of the biggest interviews I ever got was for Prudential through one of those like those organizations that you were just describing that cater to like a minority group or something like that. Yeah, take advantage of those. I didn't get that Prudential job though, because that algorithm test is really hard. But there's like a whole bunch of those groups that are trying to get more people of color into tech and stuff. So just be on the lookout for those, and they'll just get you into the interview pretty fast. Like I applied for it. I'll try to remember the name of the organization, but I applied on like a Monday, and I got the interview by that Thursday. And yeah, so just look out for those organizations.
Somebody asked about balancing interview prep versus applying. That's a good question. It's honestly going to be what feels right to you. Sometimes mentally you'll be down to like write a bunch of like cover letters. Like, don't get out of the flow if you're in the flow. If you are feeling like code, then code. You know, stay on HackerRank all night or whatever you're doing. But at the same time, if you're feeling indifferent, just split it 50-50. Just make sure you're doing something daily, you know, a little bit daily. Even when you're not in the hunt, I think a lot of us agree that we're doing something on the side to keep ourselves fresh. For me, it's never really algorithm questions, so I'll ramp up that if I'm on the interview circuit, and then I'll probably start doing like one question a day minimum. And then maybe if I get closer to the interview, I start ramming out like over a weekend before, like a bunch of questions, just so I'm really ready.
I've got work on Thursday, so I feel like should be focusing on that, but I don't know, like maybe I should apply for more jobs instead. I don't know how to balance that out.
Sure. I think, you know, with something as pivotal as like a FANG interview coming up, I would just go all in on that interview. But know that when we answered earlier about like, when do you stop? What we mean by that is like, when you leave that interview, you know, take your day, because Google interview is going to be hard as fuck. Take your day and calm down, relax. And then the next day, you don't get back on it. Don't be waiting on the phone or your email for Google to write you back, because they may never, literally. And if they do, like, even then, keep going until, again, you're getting that paycheck, you know. That's all we meant by it. But it doesn't mean that you need to, it doesn't mean that you can't context switch based off what's happening in your schedule. If you've got an interview next week, you should be focusing on that interview.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Straight up, is there a source that you use for media queue standards? Media query standards, for example, pixels per media sources. That differs per company. I'd say that's actually so layout standards is actually per company for sure. For example, there are companies that, like Datadog, for example, they don't have fixed widths on their gutters because they need to be prepared to have the UI show up on TVs, because that's often where it shows up, for example. My company, Acorns, has big ass gutters because we're only conforming to a maximum width of 1200 pixels. And so then the media queries become more strictly defined there. So I would say it's case by case. It definitely varies depending on the product that you're building, and you need to understand what your customers are going to be doing. If you're writing something that goes on TVs, then your media queries probably want to be simplified in terms of like huge, and then like laptop size and responsive. And you can feel out like what looks good. And if you really just want someone to make a decision for you, then just copy Bootstrap's media queries. They have predefined breakpoints. Read the components. Hiding or showing components? That's a good question. So a long time ago, I used to use Redux to do like a resize component selector that was called off of debounce, so that like JavaScript was listening to the size of the inner window width to resize things. Nowadays, my opinion is that instead of doing that, I'd prefer always rendering everything and then conditionally changing the display based off of the media query. Yeah, because it's more performant for CPU. So especially, you know, if we're on our desktops, we can handle like the resize chunk. But for people that are on mobile devices, which is, you know, the people that we're trying to write responsive for, why would we glut up their GPU with resize listeners when we can just let CSS do its job, which is painting and unpainting in like a very performant manner. But you will find that companies, they don't do it that way, and that's okay too. You just know that if you're asking, like, my preference is to definitely just render always and display conditionally rather than conditionally just render. Yeah, man, interviews are weird. I mean, like, I think I got my first one by just kind of like begging somebody to read a blog article on Discord, in the React community Discord. He's like, hey, I like your stuff. I'm actually hiring a junior. Want to come down for an interview? So it's the weirdest ways that you'll like get your job and or interviews. Lots of different avenues. There's no one way that it'll work, and you'll probably find that the way that you get your job is like the weirdest way. That too, I agree with AK. I think AK, I'm not sure that is the full name, but that's my favorite part about it. You go to an interview and there's no, I mean, obviously things matter in terms of like you being personable and outgoing and being a good team player. But at the end of the day, they're going to find out if you know what you're doing or not. And I personally enjoy that, especially as somebody that does know. And I also feel like many of you will find to enjoy that if you could compare it relatively to another hiring experience that's more subjective. Another thing I liked about coding is, especially a lot of y'all in here as juniors know that like you can't like try out being a pilot or a doctor. But the really cool thing is, you know, you took that pre-boot camp test that did like basic fundamentals, and hopefully you enjoyed it enough because you gave it a shot. And that's the great thing, is our barrier to entry is so low. Not necessarily to get a paying job. I'm not going to try to belittle anybody's experience there, but the barrier to entry to trying out coding is so low. I love that. Sorry if I missed anything. Cool. Anybody else got any questions?
Nah, man, I think we're good for now. Unless, Augustus, you want to say anything? That's AK. That's what I was just, I know his. No? All right, man.
What is the best soundtrack to code to? That's a subjective question.
Nah.
Lately, I've been listening to there's like a cyberpunk playlist in Spotify that's been getting me going.
You should listen to Doom soundtrack while you're coding. How you been, Kyle?
Been good, Adrian. How are you?
Been better. You know, take it one day at a time.
Your lifting form looking good, bro.
Yeah, I bought myself my own gym and just, you know, that's it. Not gonna trust any more gyms until they actually find a cure.
That's fair. Gotta be safe.
Yeah. Where are you at? You're still in Cali?
Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries.
I thought you.
I was hoping to move in New York in October actually, but I don't know if that's gonna still play out.
And I was trying to get Vincent to be on the chat, the Zoom, but you know, sometimes he's there, sometimes he's not, and
yeah, busy guy.
Yeah, you know, because not that many people know about him. Like, I was the first to discover him since he was a GA instructor when I was at GA. And like, oh shit, he's another veteran. So
yeah, he's a great guy. Love
I
Vincent. Learned a lot from him.
I was trying to get him more into this stuff, but you know, it's hard for his schedule.
Yeah,
it's whatever. All right.
All right. Well, I think I'm gonna get out of here. If anybody has any questions, I'm on Slack. I have no life, so feel free to message.
All right.
See you.
Yeah. See ya. Hey. Sweet. All right. I'm out.
No, never give up. Never surrender. What's up, man?
What's up? What are you doing?
I'm at home doing my dog. He's barking. He's fucking
Are you
retarded.
doing DJ stuff?
Sometimes.
I thought you were gonna do like a DJ. Like, you should have put the video on. Start like putting the DJ in, like the.
No, dude. DJ, I'm retarded, dude. I'm too retarded. I wanted to be like, they were like, the communities are there, the veteran community, the Chinese community. I was like, and the retard.
Hey, it's still recording.
Oh no, I gotta get out of here.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
I'm getting, this isn't me. Bye. Yo, edit. I know you got the editing software. There's 3 screens.
That's not me. I'm not recording this. It's for Conrad.
Don't cut it off when Kyle left. You hear me? Cut this off. If this is in the recording, I'm severely disappointed with you having the back. Yo.
This is Conrad. Conrad's the CEO of this.
Oh no, Conrad, edit this out.
Oh, he's a crayon eater. Come on, help him out.
It's all good.
See you out. Get out.
See, I told you I'm disabled, dude. This is all right. Bye.
Bye.